At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones in silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 6 on the agenda is detailed scrutiny of the Urban Regeneration and Housing Amendment Bill 2018. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome to today's meeting Deputy Mick Wallace and Christopher Unan, Mel Reynolds and Professor Drudy. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'd now like to call on Deputy Wallace to make his opening statement.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the Chair and the Clerk of the Committee for allocating time for detailed scrutiny of the Urban Regeneration and Housing Amendment Bill 2018. This was introduced at first stage in June 18 and passed second stage July 18, where it was supported by the opposition parties and independents, and the government didn't oppose it at that particular time. I'd like to thank PJ and Mel for agreeing to act as stakeholders and look forward to their presentations, and thank Chris Unan here who wrote the bill. The bill amends the Urban Regeneration and Housing Act 2015, referred to herein as the 2015 Act, which introduced the concept of the vacant site levy and vacant site register to deal with the problem of land hoarding. At the time, the introduction of a levy and a register for vacant sites was encouraging. However, the subsequent legislation to enact the levy was inadequate and full of loopholes. This amendment bill seeks to plug some of these holes. Overvalued development land has been having a detrimental effect on how we supply housing in Ireland for over half a century, and I've experienced it first hand. I set up my own building company in '89 and began purchasing land in the mid-90s. To give the committee an example of the land increases we saw during the Celtic Tiger, in '97 I bought a fifth of an acre site in Dublin for 150,000. In 2004 I bought a fifth of an acre in Dublin for 4.8 million. In 7 years, the price of development land in our capital city had increased more than 30-fold, and unfortunately land prices are getting back to similar exaggerated prices. And I should add that the difference in those two sites, the one I bought earlier was in a much so-called better area, and than the second one, which I paid 4.8 million for. The purpose of the bill is to disincentivise land banking and land hoarding, with a view to addressing the overall problem of the price of development land in Ireland and the effect it has on the property market. The main provisions of the bill are to provide stricter definitions for what constitutes a vacant or idle site. Secondly, to increase the vacant site levy and remove certain exemptions in relation to the levy. Thirdly, the removal of 3 of the 4 appeals allowed under the 2015 Act. And fourthly, to provide an option for the owner of the site deemed vacant to enter into negotiations with the relevant local authority or state agency to sell the site for a percentage of its value. Now, I'm actually aware we got correspondence in relation to the money message, and they say that we may be subject to a money message because of our last provision there, which was actually an effort to ease the pain for people actually sitting on sites, and so that rather than pauperise them in any way, whatever, if they were in a difficult place, we were giving them an out, so that that was financially fair, in our opinion. Section 4 of the bill amends Section 5 of the 2015 Act and provides for stricter definitions for what constitutes a vacant or idle site. Sites will now be deemed vacant if they meet the following criteria. A site where planning permission for a development has exceeded 12 months and no commencement notice for development has been issued. A site where a commencement notice for a development has been issued and 36 months have elapsed without the completion of the site in question. A site where any unauthorised use or unauthorised development is occurring, and a site which is being utilised on an unauthorised temporary basis for an activity other than development. Just that I think of as Fianna Fáil at the chamber raised the issue that a site where a commencement notice for a development had been issued and 36 months have elapsed without the completion of the site in question. They said maybe that might be a bit difficult because someone could genuinely be taking more than 36 months to complete, and I think what can be put in there comfortably is substantial completion. So it's just trying to avoid a situation where people start sites but make no effort to actually finish them out because they don't actually want to build out the site at that particular time, and we obviously want to catch those in the net because that is a form of land hoarding, obviously. Obviously, this is the most important section of the bill. The 2015 Act states that a site is vacant if the majority of the site is vacant or idle. It sounds almost Kafkaesque. This broad definition has been taken advantage of by site owners and has made it difficult for both the local authorities and Bord Pleanála to determine vacancy, and I'll give two examples of this at a later stage. Section 11 amends Section 16 of the Principal Act and provides that the vacant site levy shall be 25% of the market value of the vacant site. The exemptions in Section 16 of the Principal Act that state where the value of the mortgage or other security on the site is greater than the market value of the site, in other words a negative equity situation, a zero rate of levy shall apply, or where the outstanding amount of the site loan is between 75% and 100% of the market value of the vacant site on the date of its determination, a reduced rate of 0.75% levy shall apply, or where the outstanding amount of the site loan is between 50% and 75% of that market value of the vacant site on the date of its determination, a 1.5% rate of levy shall apply. All have been removed. The levy of 25% is applied regardless of whether there is a loan mortgage security on the site in question. Right, the first thing I should note is that following the enactment of the Planning and Development Amendment Act 2018 on the 19th of July 2018, these exemptions relating to a loan or mortgage have been removed, and it's a welcome action by the government, and maybe they do listen to us sometimes after all. At the time when the 2015 Act was being debated, I repeatedly told the government that no good business person has a site that isn't in some way mortgaged or used as security, and worse still, there is anecdotal evidence that site owners availed of these exemptions by using different companies under their control to in essence loan themselves money, thus becoming exempt from the levy, and this has come to fruition by the sparse number of the vacant site register, something that Mel might touch on during his submission. This means that the main amendment now of Section 11 is the increase of the levy to 25%. The levy currently sits at 3% and will be moved to 7% in 2020. Some may feel that 25% is too high a levy, but the goal of the legislation is to disincentivise, and 3% or even 7% will not force landholders to make use of their land. I note as well as increasing the levy to 7% in 2020, the Government have also introduced a clause giving the Minister power to vary the levy rate by way of regulations, having regard to increases, decreases in the CSO property price index. And such regulations must be approved by both houses of the Oireachtas. However, any increase in the levy rate above 7% must be subject to further primary legislation. This basically means that the Minister can lower the levy but not increase it. If this bill were to reach committee stage, I think an amendment allowing the Minister to vary the levy of 25% by either decreasing or increasing it, having regard to the current state of the economy, should alleviate some concerns about the rate of the levy. Section 12 of the bill inserts a new section which provides that where a site has been deemed vacant, The owner or owners of the site in question, prior to paying the 25% levy, may enter into negotiations with the relevant local authority or state public body to sell the site for up to 60% of its value, as determined by Section 12, if the relevant local authority or state public body deems the site viable for the supply of housing within its remit. The owner or owners of the site in question, after paying the 25% levy for year one, may again seek to enter into negotiations with the relevant local authority or state public body to sell the site for up to 40% of its value. At second stage, Minister John Paul Phelan appeared to put this option in the category of compulsory purchase orders, but that is not the case. It is merely an option for a site owner to explore selling their site to a local authority or a state body, but importantly, both parties must agree. Examples. As I have stated, a key problem of the 2015 Act related to what constituted a vacant site. The definition simply said a site is vacant if the majority of it is vacant. This has allowed both public and private site owners be quite creative when they met with a request by a local authority with regard to a site in their possession. And I'll give two examples of this, one in public ownership and one in private. A site adjacent to the Central Bank Currency Centre in Sandyford and owned by the Central Bank was placed on the vacant site register by Dún Laoghaire County Council in 2018. The site is described as being irregular in configuration and relatively flat, and covers an area of 4.67 hectares and valued at £22.5 million. The site is bounded to the north by sports pitches, to the south by the M50 slip road. To the west, the site is adjoined by existing residential development, and to the east by the main complex of the Central Bank Currency Centre. There are no structures on the site, and it is zoned Objective A to protect and or to improve residential amenity in the Dún Laoghaire County Development Plan 2016-2022. The Central Bank appealed their inclusion on the register to An Bord Pleanála and argued that the site creates a security buffer, enabling surveillance, particularly of adjoining public roads, and therefore are not vacant or idle, but serve a very clear and critically important purpose, and rationale for treating this part of the holding in a different manner to other undeveloped parts of the land holding, which also form security buffers, is unclear. Unfortunately, An Bord Pleanála accepted the argument, indicating they were bound to interpret a vacant site through Section 5 of the 15 Act. I would argue that if stricter definitions were to apply to what constitutes a vacant site, an argument such as this would not be successful. Making the argument that the site is used as a security buffer would fall under the category of unauthorised use in our bill under Section 4. This example also highlights the worrying approach of a state entity to land under their control in the midst of a housing crisis. Irish Province of the Order of the Carmelites. The second example relates to a site owned by the Carmelites, valued at £21.5 million, approximately 3.46 hectares in size. Located to the east of Ballantyre Road, the site is largely flat, with level changes to the north, and is adjacent to the rear of the property known as Gurt Wirra, which comprises a large period property. The Order of Carmelites argued that they had planning permission for a car park on the site and was therefore not vacant. The car park in question is currently not in use and does not cover the majority of the site, although it was accepted by An Bord Pleanála that the car park was not in regular use. They stated it still had planning permission and added that due to the inclusion of a permitted car park area within the boundary of the vacant site, the board considered that it was appropriate that a notice be issued to the planning authority to cancel the entry on the vacant site's register. Under our bill, the car park would fall into the category of authorised temporary basis for an activity other than development contained in Section 4. These two sites, which continue to lie vacant in a housing crisis, highlight the problems of the 2015 Act. Arguing that a site is in use because it acts as a security buffer, or contending that an unused car park means a site is in use, illuminates the current loopholes available to site owners with a bit of imagination, and it doesn't require a lot. As always with legislation concerning private property, constitutional issues arise. This is due to the prominent place private property holds within our Constitution under Article 40.3 and 43, Unfortunately, the Government constantly hides behind both articles when legislation concerning property rights is presented by opposition TDs. During second stage, both Minister English and Minister Phelan stated that previous legal advice received indicates there are significant concerns about the constitutionality of specific provisions of the Deputy's Bill, which it proposes to dramatically increase the levy from 3 to 25% of the market value of a site, remove the important and fair appeals provision in particular circumstances. This statement would appear to show that the Ministers are using previous legal advice to interpret my bill, which is never a good idea, and I note neither specifically referred to as to whether advice was received from the AG. We've secured legal advice in relation to the bill from Mr Paul McGarry, SC, former chairperson of the Bar Council, which I have shared with the committee members. I will not attempt to bring the TDs through the advice, but the basic premises of it is that none of the provisions could be labelled as unconstitutional. And with regard to the imposition of a 25% tax on site value, Mr McGarry states that it seems to me that the issue is not about whether the provisions constitute an unjust attack on the right to private property. This is because the issue of valuation is linked not to ownership but to the concept of development. Permission for development is granted by a local authority or on Board Penala. That value has already arguably been inflated by the grant by the state of the permission to develop or possibly to develop. Any infringement argument has to be seen in this context. Since the authorities state that licences or permissions come with the proviso that they may be interfered with in the common good and subject to the principles of proportionality, there should, in my view, be no difficulty in justifying the measure. With regard to the money message, we are all aware of the infamous money message, which under Dáil Standing Order 1792 provides that if a bill involves the appropriation or revenue or other public monies, committee stage shall not be taken unless the purpose of the appropriation has been recommended to the Dáil by a message from the Government. It appears that the Count Cola has determined this bill requires a money message due to the provisions of Section 12 of the bill. As already outlined, Section 12 is entirely optional and can only be exercised with the agreement of both the site owner and local authority. I would ask the committee to examine this ruling by the Count Cola, as it would be unfortunate if the bill were not to progress due to this one element, as the key provisions of the bill, stricter definitions of what a vacant site is, removing the multiple appeals and increasing the levy, must be implemented if the vacant site levy is to achieve its goal of putting an end to land hoarding. I'd like to thank the Chair and the members for their attention, and would gladly ask and answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mick. I now like to call on Professor Druddy to make his opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair, for having me, and thank you to the other deputies and senators. Basically, I think the bill is a good one, and I think it's important. It is an important element if we are to increase the supply of land and hence housing. And if we achieve that, if we increase the supply of land and housing, we will actually reduce house prices and rents. Now, I know that may not appeal in some quarters, but I think it's a very important goal for everybody to try to achieve, because house prices and rents are, in my view, too high. So just very quickly to go through the crisis, and I'm not telling you anything that you don't know already, but basically we have a crisis. Home ownership is quite difficult for people, to put it mildly. It's beyond the reach of many, many young people and not so young people. And so the housing market in many ways is not working. Supply and demand are the two critical issues. And supply is not coming on stream fast enough. There's remarkable volatility in this market, really, as you'll see from the table on page 1, where we had, in 1975, 18,000 homes were built by the private sector. In 2005, that shot up to 75,000, and many of those houses in areas where they were not required, far, far too many, resulting ghost estates, etc. And then in 2018, down to 13,800. So there's something radically wrong with a market where there's massive demand at the present time for housing, and yet that small amount of houses are being built. So in my view, the market is failing, really. The market isn't working. Remarkable volatility between in the private sector, really. And I'm not here to criticise the private sector, but I suppose the message I would like to get across is that reliance on the private sector alone is inadequate. And I've heard many Dáil deputies and senators saying that over the years. So the data there on the right-hand side of the table shows that local authority provision and approved housing body provision hasn't been much better. In fact, it has been very bad, and it's dramatically dropped from almost 9,000 homes in 1975 down to 4,251. Now, of those 4,251, in fact, Part 5 and the turnkey ones, new homes being purchased by the local authority from the private sector, as you'll see it at the very bottom of the page. So the local authorities themselves are building small amounts, as you know. So the end product of it all is really that house prices have increased significantly and are badly out of line with general inflation, with the cost of building and with average earnings. And I give a diagram there on page 2 showing how new apartment and house prices have changed. And really the prices are now way above what they were at the peak in 2007. And I think that's very problematic, really. 30 years ago, a mortgage could be received by one person, and that one modest salary would buy a house. Nowadays, that's out of the question for a lot of our young people, and I think there's something radically wrong with that. Working couples with childcare costs struggle with the equivalent of 2 mortgages. Now, I'd just like to mention, apart from supply is critical, but demand is also an issue. And it will be obvious from the previous table, on table 1, that the local authorities are actually purchasing turnkey homes. And this was alluded to, I think, by Deputy O'Brien there recently in the newspaper. And I think that's a problem. If you have local authorities purchasing homes, they're obviously in competition with young people. And I think that's a problem. So and there are other people other than local authorities. Of course, the approved housing bodies are also purchasing. And of course, there's other non-households purchasing. So we've got a real problem here of young and not so young people having to compete with these people who shouldn't be purchasing houses. Certainly the local authority, in my view, and I know it's been the practice for many, many years, but the local authorities and the approved housing bodies should really build houses rather than purchase them. So that's an important point. So that's the purchasing. But the private rented sector is equally problematic, and basically you know all the problems. Increasing and unaffordable rents, insecurity of tenure and poor standards. And I think, in fairness to the government, the introduction of rent regulation was a very important element, really, in trying to resolve the problem. It was much criticised at the time, and there was an enormous amount of lobbying by major international companies in particular against it. And I'm very pleased to say that at the time, Mr. Coveney and the government stuck out against it and went along with it. Now, the only thing I would say about it is that ideally that rent regulation should be extended throughout the country as opposed to having simply pressure zones. But it was a good initiative, and I certainly argued strongly for it way back a few years ago in the Housing and Homelessness Oireachtas Committee. Now, the other problem in the private rented sector, and you will all be aware of this, is that there are a range of multinational and property developers purchasing and now control a high proportion of the houses and apartments being available, and they're buying in blocks. And I think that's a real problem, and I'm not quite sure how to deal with it, but it is a problem, and the government, I have no doubt, is aware of it. And I'm sure the chairperson is aware of it, being chair of this important committee. But it certainly needs action of some sort. However it's done, I do not know. Now, there's negative consequences. The real point to make here is that there's huge negative consequences related to high house prices and rents. And first of all, we know they're completely out of line with the Consumer Price Index, average earnings and the cost of building. But secondly, they're bad for the economy. And that's a central point, really. A high proportion of disposable income is tied up repaying mortgage debt or rents for an extended period, and the result is less disposable income to spend on employment-creating activities. So there's something radically wrong with the situation where huge amounts of people's incomes have to be spent on housing. It's wrong. And those of you, there are very few young people or very few older people in this place than me, obviously, but some of you young people wouldn't understand that way, way back, you could buy a house with one salary, quite easily. So some people benefit, obviously, and some homeowners think we're sitting on a gold mine, we're very happy. I think they're very foolish. They should think of their children and their grandchildren, really. Apart from the economic reasons for trying to keep down house prices and rents, there are social equity and ethical reasons why housing should not be expensive. And really, housing should surely be a home rather than a commodity. And I think the commodification of housing is a very serious problem. And financialisation is a huge issue now. It's a global issue where large finance companies, large funds are coming in to purchase housing. They see it as a fine, fantastic, sound asset to purchase, but they're not thinking of our young people. That's the problem. Now, the other problem, of course, apart from the private sector, is that there's been a dramatic decline in the construction of homes by local authorities, housing associations and other non-profit organisations, and you see that from the table earlier. And really, it is not good enough, I'm sorry to say. We really have to return to a situation where the local authorities, the government, first of all, has a policy of ensuring that local authorities and other AHBs and so on really do build houses. And I'm afraid since 2004, and I remember writing about this way back 15, 16 years ago, we've turned to the private rented sector. It's not just one government. Successive governments have relied unduly, in my view, on the private rented sector to provide social housing. And the cost is enormous. I mean, over 900 million. I think Mel has just given me a figure for 2018 of 934 million spent on a combination of homelessness and the rent supplement and RAS and HAP and so on. An enormous range, and I know it's well-intentioned, I have no doubt about it, but not a single extra long-term home is available as a result of this enormous expenditure. So I really feel we should think again. So it's essential, in my view, to reverse the alarming reduction in the provision of public housing. And I think we really also should get away from the idea of reliance on the private rented sector. I think it's foolish. I know it may be well-intentioned, but I think it's foolish. And if the state becomes involved, and this is a key point, if the state becomes involved in a serious way, it can compete with the private sector. And if it is competing with the private sector, if we built, for example, a lot of social housing, but also cost rental housing. I won't go into detail on it now, but basically you're building homes for the cost of construction and maintenance and so on, and you're letting them not just to social housing tenants, but to a whole range of people who are above the threshold for social housing. And you're integrating the two. You're integrating social and cost rental. I believe that the state having a serious role, the state owns the land and the state can do this. And it would actually save money on HAP and RAS because the rents would be lower for social housing tenants, and the subsidies would be much lower, as well as the rents would be lower for the person who is above the threshold. So I would argue very strongly for a strong move by the state. In fairness to the government, it's already accepted the idea of cost rental. And there's one fine scheme, and the chair will know of it, on the Enniskerry Road under Dunleary County Council. And there's another scheme, I think is underway in Inchicore, again accepted by the government. So there's no doubt about it, the government is amenable to this, and the minister is amenable. So I think we simply have to move ahead on it rather rapidly. So So I've made the point about the need for supply is important, as well as demand. Now, land availability, I won't bore you again with the figures or the stuff I've given you, and I think Mel has much the same stuff. Basically, there's lots of land available. The Land Availability Survey in 2004 illustrated that very clearly, and of course there's various vacant site surveys by the local authorities and so on, which show clearly that land is a key element. And the Rebuilding Ireland, of course, and NESC have accepted that a key issue is land. We've got to have the land or we cannot do anything. So the land is capable of producing enormous amounts of housing. I won't go into the figures again, but basically in the Dublin local authorities alone, 2,600 hectares available, capable of 116,000 homes. That's a lot of houses. And they're needed. We need around 30,000 homes per annum, not just 18 as was produced last year. So, I mean, there's tremendous possibilities. So basically, in conclusion, Chair, and thank you for your patience with me, it's important to acknowledge that genuine efforts have been made to date. No use kind of criticising and saying nothing has been done, because that would be unfair. But really, more needs to be done. Urgent action is required in relation to unused land, and that's the purpose of this bill, to bring forward residential development. And it seems to me that there is hoarding of land, and there's drip feeding of land, drip feeding of houses onto the market to keep the prices high. So I really feel that this bill has the possibility of making a dramatic change. I think there's great interest by the government anyway. Minister English already introduced various changes. So I mean, and across the political spectrum, there seems to be agreement that this is very important. So I think, thank you very much, Chair. That's, I think, all I want to say at this stage. I'll answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much. Mel, welcome your reference.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to present to the committee here. There are three main sections to my own presentation. Some of them have touched on areas that PJ has already mentioned. In 20 years, wages have increased by 22%, while house prices have increased in the commuter belt in Dublin by around 150%. So house prices are increasing at 7 times the rate of wage increases. Now, this 20-year trend has a significant impact on affordability for first-time buyers and society as a whole. Higher rents means it's taking longer to save for deposits, buyers are older, they have to work longer, and 2 full-time salaries and/or significant equity from parents is required to buy a home. Increased construction costs and building standards are not the problem. So in terms of an overview of housing supply, the Housing Agency back in 2017 suggested a minimum of 16,000 new homes were required in urban areas every year to 2020 to meet demand. According to the CSO, there were a little over 13,000 scheme homes and apartments. These are for sale, excluding single homes, out of a total number of 18,000 completed last year. Now, contrary to a lot of commentary, the state is actually very active in the new build sector, but in very particular ways. In 2018, local authorities and approved housing bodies purchased or built almost 4,600 dwellings, including Part 5 units. Of this figure, 64% were purchases of new homes from the private sector. The average price paid for local authority, turnkey and new build social housing authority dwellings was less than the affordable threshold of €240,000. On the other side, NAMA has funded the construction of 2,500 new homes last year. 40% of these homes funded by NAMA sold for more than €400,000 and 67% sold for more than €300,000, way above the affordable threshold. So between these two figures, excluding purpose-built social housing, the state subvented more than half of all private dwellings built for sale last year, which is a huge number. Unfortunately, the state is competing with ordinary buyers in the affordable housing market while simultaneously using state funds to build severely unaffordable schemes. When it comes to affordable housing, there is just one affordable housing scheme being built nationwide by a Coulon housing co-op in Ballymun. In partnership with Dublin City Council, they are building a scheme of over 30 dwellings with 2-bed units priced at €185,000 up to 3-bed homes at €219,000 including VAT and developer's profit. This scheme is privately financed and will be completed this year. Now, Budget 2018 saw the introduction of an affordable housing fund, which was expanded last year to €310 million. This fund is a subsidy scheme intended to give up to 40% discounts on homes built on state land, up to €50,000 per unit, and 10 locations have been selected. Infrastructure and services works are yet to commence on these sites. No homes have been delivered to date, and the earliest projected completions date is late in 2020. Now, given that construction price inflation is well over 7% at the moment, a 3-year delay in delivery will add more than 20% onto costs, further impacting affordability. So homes in these schemes may also be suitable for the Help to Buy scheme, adding a further €20,000 per unit to state costs. Is this sustainable? In terms of public housing supply, over 90% of additional state social housing is sourced from the private sector. According to Rebuilding Ireland, of the 27,100 social housing solutions delivered nationwide from all sources in 2018, just 1,600 homes, 6%, were built by local authorities and approved housing bodies. In 2017, a year before, 4% were built by local authorities and approved housing bodies. So the state is extremely reliant on the private sector for this. In 2018, there were 18,000 new housing assistance payment leases created. This is actually a very accurate measure of the distress in the rental sector. The 5-year target under the Rebuilding Action Plan is 87,500 new HAP tenancies by 2021. This would be 1 in 4 private sector tenancies. Last year, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform estimated that if these targets are achieved, spending on rent assistance will increase from the current spend of over £1 billion a year to £1.7 billion per annum by 2022. This is the equivalent of spending a new children's hospital, the cost of a new children's hospital per year on rents to private landlords. DEPA also noted that it is twice as expensive to engage in rent assistance in areas of high demand like Dublin than building on state land over a 30-year period. Current policy appears at odds with the DEPA recommendations. Local authorities are buying and building in areas of low demand while continuing to create new HAP tenancies at scale in County Dublin. In 2018, just 634 new social homes were built by the 4 Dublin local authorities, including regeneration units, which involve demolition. Demolitions and sales of existing stock will be removed, leaving a lower net additional figure of additional stock. Now, just briefly moving on to land, PJ mentioned it earlier. In 2015, the Land Availability Survey confirmed that there was a nationwide capacity for about 414,000 dwellings on zoned land nationwide. In Dublin, there's space for 116,000 dwellings, so we do have an abundance of development land. Unfortunately, much of the current development is in a piecemeal, low-density commuter estates, increasing urban sprawl and not maximising the potential of this well-located, centrally located land. When it comes to state-controlled land, an analysis last year confirmed, excluding land owned by other semi-state bodies like the IDA, Coillte, the Housing Agency and CIE, the National Asset Management Agency, NAMA, debtors and local authorities own 17% of residential zoned land nationwide, with a capacity for more than 100,000 dwellings. The approximate breakdown here is NAMA controls 60% of this and local authorities own 40%. But it's enough state-owned land for more than 40,000 dwellings nationwide, owned by local authorities. Densities have subsequently increased from the 2015 figure given the lifting of the height caps. When you look at Dublin, between NAMA-controlled debtors and local authorities, almost half of all residential loans and zoned land with capacity for more than 55,000 dwellings is controlled by the state. In Dublin City alone, almost 3 in 4 vacant sites are controlled by the state, Dublin City Council owning half of those sites. Moving on to land values and affordability, we see that land price is a very significant issue currently affecting affordability. Typically, upwards of 35% of the sales price of a dwelling is comprised of land value and developer's profit, although this can be a lot higher. Land price is extremely volatile. A 10% increase in a new home price translates into a 30% increase in land values. However, the opposite is also true, and land values can fall dramatically when prices soften. Land trading and speculation is a feature of the Dublin land market, with less than 1/4 of residential planning permissions turning into completed units after 3 years. The residual site value for land is derived from the sales price less cost and margin. In some Dublin locations, the residual value is significantly exceeded. Now, this suggests an inflated land market. When developers overpay for land, developments stall until sales prices increase to a level where it's viable, i.e. it's profitable to build. Developers will not build where they're going to make a loss. 40 years of CSO data since 1975 demonstrate that demand leads supply by about 12 months. So the current stalling sales levels and prices suggest a drop in the number of homes being built in the latter part of this year in certain locations. So when prices fall, supply falls. Now, the difficulty that we have in terms of policy is that a number of policy initiatives have encouraged investors to purchase and hold large tracts of service residential development land for long periods. A capital gains tax exemption in 2012 and 2016, coupled with a weak vacant site levy in the same year, have contributed to inflationary pressures on land prices. Amendments have been made to the prescribed 7-year hold period for CGT and has resulted in the highest volume of land traded in more than a decade at 1.5 billion last year. Much of this land is held by entities with no construction capacity whatsoever. The state owns significant land banks, but policy is not to develop and to be almost entirely reliant on the private sector for public housing. Policies have sought to reduce standards on the one side as incentives to developers while introducing demand-side measures to boost price, the Help to Buy scheme for purchasers. These have had the desired effect to improve viability and asset prices, improving balance sheets, and there's a number of positive outcomes to that. It also makes developments viable and raises households out of negative equity. However, same policies lead to sharp land and house price inflation, increasing rental levels, and consequent increases in homelessness. So policy has inflated land values and has simultaneously impacted affordability. One critical area that has affected prices is the promotion of alternative uses. We know that planning changes have delayed development and encouraged repeat applications and land speculation. Analysis by Dublin Chamber of Planning applications for new apartment developments in Dublin suggests recent planning reforms have had the dampening effect on the supply of new apartments. Added to this is the inflationary effects of new, more intensive forms of residential development currently being promoted by policy. Co-housing, shared living developments and student housing are short-term intensive uses that are extremely profitable. In the midst of a housing shortage, the industry continues to prioritise student housing schemes. So just one brief example of this is the recent sale of a large student housing scheme in Ballymun. The sales price was 46 million for 364 bed spaces, equating to €126,000 per bed space. Now, in planning terms, a 4-bed space unit is the equivalent size to a normal 2-bed apartment. So in order for residential to be as profitable as this scheme, it would need to sell for more than €500,000 in Ballymun. Currently, if you go on Daft, you can see 2 beds for sale for 150 to 170,000. So sites for student housing or new co-living uses are significantly more valuable than normal residential in most Dublin locations, and apartments will not be built unless this trend is addressed. So finally, very briefly, just on the vacant site levy. The vacant site levy was proposed in 2016 to penalise owners of vacant land and to stimulate activity. Although introduced in January 2017, the tax is only charged from this year onwards for sites included on registers. The levy had been on a sliding scale. The bigger the loan attached to the land, the lower the levy due. The original maximum level was 3% based on a 2018 value. The Department last October, to its credit, have moved to make the levy more effective towards owners, removing the sliding scale and increasing the levy to 7%. However, questions still surround the effectiveness of the measure in this current market. To date, just 21 out of 31 local authorities have listed sites as vacant on public registers. Dublin City Council is one of the most proactive of all the local authorities, and their register includes about 16 hectares of land that they own themselves. However, this is a fraction of the 112 hectares of vacant zoned residential land currently included by DCC and on the Rebuilding Ireland Land Availability Plan. Figures for other local authorities that have populated registers are lower again. Despite the best intentions of the Department of Housing, local authorities appear reluctant to implement the site levy and have cited a number of reasons, from lack of resources to low land values. This inertia worryingly suggests that local authorities have little resources or support from government for strategic land management. So, just in conclusion, The supply of public housing is very heavily reliant on the private sector. This is a very expensive way to meet demand. You're paying market value for units, high site prices, expensive financing costs and developers' margins. NESC and DEEPR have recommended that the state directly procure social housing on state land in areas of high demand like County Dublin and continue rent supplement in low demand areas where prices and rents are lower. In a time of constrained industry output, such over-reliance on the private sector is having an inflationary effect on rents, prices and land values. Affordable housing schemes that rely on discounted purchase prices effectively subvent high prices and are very prone to failure in downturns. Current policy assumes new housing output will continue to increase and has not been risk assessed to take into account the cyclical nature of development. When the cycle turns, less money is available, which means fewer houses will be produced by the private sector, leading to fewer dwellings available to rent or purchase. This is really high-risk strategy, and indications are that we are at or close to the peak of the current cycle. A proper functioning vacant site levy, implemented in a transparent and consistent manner by all local authorities, should be encouraged. Once changes are signalled in an unambiguous and timely manner, cost will transfer back into site values. Proceeds from any site levy should be ring-fenced to provide finance for affordable housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. So before we start, just remind members we're here to scrutinise Deputy Wallace's bill, and we are sticking to that. And our next private member's bill is June 11, so we will let them know that we're running slightly over. But we're going to take questions to Deputy Wallace first, in case Deputy Wallace has any questions to ask himself of the other witnesses as well. So, Pat.
Thanks, Chair. And I suppose one of the key objectives of all here is to try and deliver affordable housing. And one of the key factors in trying to deliver affordable housing is indeed how we manage our land, both state and private land. So can I thank Mick for bringing this bill before us, and maybe a few specific questions around the bill itself. And first of all, I have to say the vacant site levy I don't think has worked at all in what it was intended to do. I think there's been lack of engagement by local authorities to get real with it, and how the site selection was done, and some local authorities are more proactive, others are not proactive. So there's a whole lot of stuff out there that just hasn't clicked in or made this work as it was envisaged, number one. But equally, I think there was a lot of get-out clauses in it, as you have identified. But just trying to maybe hone in on a few specific ones, and it's something I've been sort of thinking in my own head. What's causing land prices to continue to escalate and escalate? And while hoarding and land banking is part of that, flipping is also another part of it, which goes back to the planning permission process. And I've sort of, over a period of time, says, do we need to actually look at what the final grant of planning permission is? And if I'm a developer, it's quite easy on zone land to get planning permission and very cost effective. But should that final grant of planning permission not include construction drawings and building drawings, where at that stage the developer has to invest significant funding to deliver construction drawings before the final grant of planning permission? Just another alternative, because the reason I'm probably asking that is one of your things is a site where planning permission for development has exceeded 12 months. By the time you get planning permission and get construction drawings done, detailed drawings done to go to site, you could very easily have exceeded that 12-month period. Not that I don't agree with it, but what I've been looking at is trying to look at the planning system and see, should we actually look at planning and say that before you get your final grant, it should include construction drawings, which is another cost on the developer, but it commits them to that site rather than just getting a planning permission and flipping it. And you already mentioned in relation to the 36 months, you know, I think if there's a commitment in there, we all know sites gets into trouble and there's stuff that slows things down. And I appreciate that you said that you will be willing to look at that and see what way we could eke it out. The other thing, maybe, Mick, if you could work through your logic in relation to the landowner being able to sell to the local authority at 40% of the market, the rent, but there's no onus on him to sell it to it. It's up to the landowner to sell that. How would that work out? Like, how will that reduce. If the landowner doesn't have to sell it, I mean, how will it affect them? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So what's he? Do you know what I mean? What's the point having it there if he doesn't have to sell it? There are just a few things specifically in relation to the bill itself, and I'll come back on the other areas then later on. Is that the format?
Or if you want to put them to Mel and Mr. Judy, then
A lot of it evolved into a whole housing debate, I think, and a lot of the information came into the whole housing debate. And I'm going to say one thing now, because it's becoming a huge concern of mine, is in relation to the state buying turnkey operations or turnkey developments. And Minister Murphy gave us a commitment here last year ago. He would stop interfering in the private market. He would stop buying private housing development. And he has stopped buying the 1, 2s, the 3s or 4. But what's happening now, they're going in and they're buying whole developments. And in in Wicklow town alone, I'd say the state are interfering in the private market. There's one development I know of 40 houses that they've gone in and bought the whole lot. There's another one of 150, they're going in and buying 75 of them. And there's another one in Rathnew where there's 100 and they're buying 88 of them. Like, they were all houses that were meant for people who wanted to get on the housing ladder. And now the state, have interfered in it, taken them away from the potential first-time buyers and taken them into state stock. And it goes back to the fundamental principle. The state needs to take control of building its own housing and not depending on the private sector. And I have to say, it's becoming more evident year on year that the government are now relying on turnkey operations to deliver their figures, and that's taking housing out of the private market, and it's actually adding to inflating the cost of housing the first-time buyers. I'll leave it at that for the moment, Maria, and I might come back in later on.
Mick?
Yeah, you put 3 questions to me, Pat. Okay, your first question around the working drawings. I mean, it's actually a very good question, and I'd be very conscious of the fact that I used to get planning permission, and I wouldn't have had my working drawings done because we were afraid we wouldn't get permission. Okay, and when you do the working drawings in advance, and then you're told, well, actually, that's not exactly how we might like it, and they might make changes. Now, obviously, collaboration in advance of going to planning is a good way of doing things, obviously, right? But it's not finite, right? So, insisting on all the work and drawings being done in advance, with my developer's hat on, or my builder's hat on, it's actually putting a serious expense on the builder-developer to do it that way. And the follow-on problem then that you highlighted is that, well, in actual fact, is 12 months enough after you get permission? I suppose in my own experience, it was always more than enough, right? By the time we would have, we were able to get working drawings done in about 2 to 3 months max, right? And so by giving us 12 months, after getting planning permission, I don't remember ever sitting on the land for more than 12 months because, to be honest with you, because we weren't land bankers, right? So we had to buy the land from people who had banked land, and we were paying a lot of money for it. So we had a huge incentive to build it as quickly as possible. And like, for example, I'll give you an example. I bought a site on Dominic Street. In fact, it was that 1/5 of an acre I referred to there, where I paid 4.8 million for it. By the time I bought the site, I designed it, I got my permission, and I got started. And then I spent about 2 years building it, right? My interest, my site cost me 4.8, right? The interest on that, from the time I bought it to the time I sold the apartment, was about 1.2, right? So I ended up paying for the site and the interest of 6 million. Now, it cost me the same to build the place, right? So land and interest was half the price, okay? But my point is that money was 6% at the time. For me, 6 or 6.5 is what I always had to pay, right? The point is that I was paying so much money to the banks from the day I bought it. I couldn't get out of the site quick enough in order to get finished quick enough in order to stop paying so much interest. I can remember when we were about 3/4 way through the job, we were paying the bank, because we had now spent a whole lot of money building as well, we were paying 80,000 a month in interest. So for every month earlier I could finish, I was saving 80,000. I mean, it's nuts. But there's a huge incentive to start and get going. So people who genuinely are going to build, I'm pretty confident they get on site within 12 months. But there would be, if for example something happened and he had problems with his working drawings or whatever, right, and he had to spend longer and he wasn't on site he didn't actually start for 18 months, then there is an appeal mechanism rather than to be fined for it. And if the concerns are genuine and his problems are genuine, then they'll be listened to and they'll be fairly treated. Likewise with the 36-month thing, your second point. If you've started a job and you're not finished in 3 years, and that can happen, but it's actually especially with residential, it's unusual. If you ask me to build you 20 houses or build you 100 or apartments, in that matter, it takes me nearly the same time. Believe it or not, there's not a big difference in the time. But if a guy, I mentioned earlier that rather than say it has to be completed within 36 months, we should say substantially completed. And likewise, you have the appeal mechanism where if a fellow is actually trying to finish and he's not actually he didn't just start the site so that he wouldn't be paying a site levy and he didn't really want to build then, I mean, he get fairly treated. It'll be pretty obvious as to whether he's trying to finish or not, or whether he's actually building out. And I can tell you, if anyone does half the work, I guarantee they're going to keep going because of the price of money. You'd be mad to stop because it's just too expensive to stop. Because you've invested so much into it at that stage, so there's a great incentive to keep going. So I think it'll be pretty obvious whether the builder or developer is being genuine or not. On the issue of the 40% and 60%, well, really what we were doing there was, okay, we were saying, you have a vacant site. It's classified as a vacant site, and we've tied down the definition much more finely. And, okay, Mr. Jones has a site now, and there's planning permission for 100 houses, but he doesn't feel like building them yet because he knows the price is going up and he'll make more money if he holds on. Okay, we introduced a 25% levy on him. Okay, serious disincentive to hold it, right? So, supposing he has difficulty selling on the private market, supposing he's in trouble now because he owes a lot of money already on when he bought it and he has 25% to pay on it every year now, we'll put them to the pin of his collar. So what we did was, this was actually, it's like a stop to the developer, right, or to the landholder. We're giving them an out. We're giving them an opportunity, if it suits them, and if it suits the local authority, we're giving them an opportunity to sell it for 60% of an agreed market value in the year one. And if he doesn't take it up and pays his tax the first year, we're actually letting him back in the second year for a chance to sell it at 40% of it. But obviously, it's far more attractive for him not to pay 25% the first year, sell it to the local authority at 60%. So really, it's an opportunity for them to get out of it without being skint, right? In case he has problems selling it, in case he can't get the funding to build it out. Because some people can't get funding to build out projects, right? Now, Chris pointed out to me this morning, Dublin City Council have just done a report on their problems with the vacant site levy, and they've pointed out that 162 sites were found that would have actually qualified, but they're actually smaller than the site, than the area that was identified in the site levy legislation. I know Grace tried to bring that down, and now it was actually at 0.1, and I argued to get it down to 0.05, which I managed to do with amendments in the chamber at that time. But it's, in actual fact, come to think of it, with 162 sites that are just under the 0.05, which is actually 500 square feet, there is a good argument for actually bringing it down a bit more, and it could be brought down to 0.03, because you can be surprised how much if you brought it as on the sites that are under 0.5 or 0.05, you could get 10 to 15, 10 to 12, 13 apartments on them, for example. You can't build on the whole space because you've got you have your public space challenge, and you have to adhere to that. But there is an argument for bringing it down a bit further. But in a lot of those sites, they're small sites. They're not owned by big players. Big players don't bother themselves with small sites, so they're owned by smaller entities, and they may have struggled to actually get the funding to build them. Right? It's not easy. It's easy. You know, it is difficult at the moment to get funding to build sites in the country. That is the truth. Right?
Yeah, and just on that point, and that's why I have some concern about the 36 months. And you would know, and when you talk about the small builder, and that's who we're sort of talking about here, they cannot get the finance to build the entire development out, and they're getting piecemeal funding, so they're allowed to build 5 or 10, pocket that money, and then the bank might bankroll the next 5 or 10. And this is why it's become attractive for the state to come in and buy the whole development, and then the developer says, and this is creating an opportunity. But that's just on that point. And just to come back, because I know I'll probably have to, my idea on the planning is to try and prevent speculators that just get planning permission. Do you know what I mean? And that's why I was trying to look at having construction drawings built into the planning process. At least you're showing a commitment. You refer to the developers who want to develop out, but there's developers out there who just want to get planning and flip it and move on. And that's why I was looking at a sort of two-stage planning process that includes building drawings, Mick. That was all I was looking at there.
Yeah, but I mean, with regard to the guy flipping it, right, if he gets his planning permission and he just wants to flip it there, well, first of all, he has a certain period before he's going to start paying the levy, right? And now, obviously, if he waits 11 months and then flips it, and then does the other guy get 12 months as well, and do they keep flipping it? A good, healthy stamp duty comes into play there, because, for example, on that Donnelly Street site, I paid $500,000 stamp duty, right? Now, but we've actually seriously reduced stamp duty now, so it actually encourages flipping a bit more. But also, of course, in a different area, I better not go into it too much, but a lot of the big players were avoiding paying stamp duty back in the good days. There was a number of different vehicles that you could use, and you paid no stamp duty, and it was actually legal, and unfortunately so, but that's a different area.
Niall or PJ, do you want to come back on anything there?
No, I was surprised at Pat Casey's. I'm in agreement with him, obviously, in relation to the large number of houses being purchased by the local authority in Wicklow. I'm astonished at the numbers, and it's very worrying, really.
No, it is, because it's taking them away from ordinary people who are trying to buy houses.
Indeed, 150 houses seems remarkable, which they should be building, really. That's the only comment I would make, Chair.
Do you want to come back on anything?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's sort of along those lines. I mean, the really surprising figure to me when doing the prep work for this was the extent of state involvement in the private housing sector. The fact that we've, I think, excluding the Help to Buy scheme, which would add more state-subvented units into it, something like 53% of all privately built houses that are estate homes and apartments built for sale are in some way subvented by the state. That's either built for, funded by NAMA, or purchased as turnkey purchases. I think between approved housing bodies and local authorities, over 2,000 privately built houses last year were purchased from the private sector. So that would be very low. If we were building 50,000 units a year, to be fine. There's 13,000 built last year. So there's no question in my mind that not only is the state the sort of cocktail of state policies inflating the private sector market, but also the sort of HAP system where we're looking at something like, at the moment, I think when all programmes are looked at, we've a third of all private sector tenancies are state subvented as well. So you have all this state money going in, inflating the private sector market where we're competing with private sector buyers. It's very worrying. And also we may be heading into a stalled or a downturn period now at the moment. So any of the initiatives we're looking at, they should be looked at the filter to say what happens when new house supply actually drops. What happens then to it? So.
Thanks, Mel. Grace?
I suppose just to wake up to this morning's news that the highest numbers of homeless, over 10,000 this morning, is absolutely shocking, and everything has to be done to try to facilitate the building of housing. And you said, PJ, that the market is failing us at the moment, and Mel, you're saying the same. But just specifically with regard to the legislation, local authorities are telling me that the site levy doesn't work because they don't have the capacity to actually collect it. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the legislation, and which I completely support and welcome, and I hope it passes through the system as soon as possible, but how can we ensure that the levy can be collected and then ring-fenced in order to support the supply of housing, which is totally failing at the moment? I mean, it's very depressing to sit here, you know, 2 and a half years into the government policy, Rebuilding Ireland, and just seeing every facet of it really failing. You know, you were talking about the student housing. Everywhere you look at it, the system's failing. So this is a piece of legislation that I support, but what can be done to ensure that the levy, which, you know, the government has increased from a meagre 3 to 7%, which won't really do the job, but, you know, that how can we ensure it can be collected and that it can work to actually free up the land to start building on it?
Right. Just to go back to your first point, you're talking about the homeless figures this morning. I mean, the fact that land is too dear in Ireland leads to expensive housing. The fact that we have expensive housing, it leads to evictions because people can't make their payments because the initial price is beyond them at this stage, and they get evicted out of it and they become homeless. Rents are too high because the properties are too high. Obviously, we haven't managed the rent well either, and PJ talks about it was good that the 4% thing came in, but the big problem there is that we started up there and we're only allowing 4% above that. We didn't start at a common sense level, at an affordable level. We started where it's already gone mad. Okay, so we're only allowing 4% per year to go above that. So the bar has been too high just to start. So, but there's a real, the main reason that property is too dear in Ireland, residential property is too dear in Ireland, is because of land banking. That is the truth. And I've made the point several times, but in mainland Europe, you go 30 kilometres outside the centre of any city in Europe, you get a 3-bed house for 160,000. It costs you double in Dublin. If you go 30 kilometres outside Dublin, you pay double that for your 3-bed house. That's mad. And it's built in to the land price, and we're one of the few countries that actually don't control. We don't tax the gain on that land that you're sitting on, and it's going up and up and up and up. It's a free meal for them, right? And as long as we allow that to continue, we're going to continue to have very expensive land. Now, it'll go up and down, which is mad as well. And the states should be avoiding situations where things go up and down, because it leads to insecurity, it leads to problems, and in the case of housing, it leads to homelessness. On your second point about the vacant site levy, the local authorities have made it very plain that, we've really struggled with it. Some of them have no sites on their vacant site levy for January 19 on their vacant site lists. Some of them said that they couldn't handle it because there was too many loopholes in it, and our bill is addressing a lot of that. We're tightening it up so it's actually more plain and clear to the local authority. This is what a vacant site is. No, this isn't one. Because it was so clouded and so vague, there was more holes in it than in a sieve, and it was too easy for them. And I pointed out two simple examples where it was so easy to argue our way out of, oh no, my site's not really vacant, I'm using it for this, that and dollar. With regard to resources, have they got the resources to collect the levy? Well, if they haven't got it, given that it will bring in a lot of money, how about resourcing the local authorities to be able to do it? If they don't have enough staff to do it, let's give them to them, because it would be a very good investment for the government, because they'll get buckets of money back if they can get this thing up and running, and especially at a proper rate, like 25%. There's a huge amount of money to be taken in by the state on an annual basis if we tax land banking, and the money can be ring-fenced for social housing.
Just briefly to come in on that, to put a number on it. Currently, just in Dublin city centre, which is an area where Dublin City Council are very active, they've done their vacant site study in 2015. They know where all the vacant sites are. There's 298 hectares of zoned residential land currently. The value per hectare, roughly speaking, is around 10 million per hectare. So that's €3 billion worth of land currently that's in Dublin City, only Dublin City. Now, if Mick's proposal is correct and if he brings more land into this, let's say, for example, if half of that land was brought into the levy and it was bumped up to 20%, that's €300 million in year one just in Dublin City Council, which could be ring-fenced for affordable housing. On the flip side, we know that the loans, I think Michelle Norris had quoted, that the loans attached to the state's land bank and local authorities is about 450 million. So the potential for this measure as a counter-cyclical potential to deliver affordable housing is really strong. This is the most compelling thing for me about this, is the fact that this isn't just about beating somebody with a stick. It's about the state sort of pulling back and saying, OK, the market's gone bananas. Let's harvest some of it. We've no capital gains. We've no way to increase revenue. This is a really, really quick and easy way to harvest some of the gain that in some locations in Dublin site prices have gone up fivefold. So landowners won't like it, and people who are involved in land speculation will not like it. As Mick said, for developers and builders, they've nothing to fear here, because if they're intent on building, this will have a mitigating effect on price rises. If any changes to the vacant site levy are introduced in a consistent way and clear way and telegraphed in advance, the market will not mind that, because it will be reflected in land values, which is ultimately what we want, is to see the land market calming down. But you could find that the entire loans associated with local authority housing could be extinguished in the first year of operation of this enhanced levy. So that would allow local authorities then to turn around with land banks and no loans attached to them and pass on those sites to ordinary buyers at the discounts that we're seeing that O'Coulon are doing. Because that's one of the challenges in the affordable housing model, is who pays for the site. It isn't, if the purchaser pays for the site, it's not affordable, and the local authority is left with a hole on its balance sheet. But if they were able to ring-fence the money for that purpose and pay off the loans, this is a really, really compelling counter-cyclical measure here that would in some way start to unpick what we see going on, what you've mentioned there in the wider housing sector.
Sorry, but just on the collection of the levy, Chris just pointed out to me, I mean, the fact that we're removing 3 of the 4 appeals will make it a lot easier to collect it. At the moment, Section 18 of the 15 Act allows the site owner to appeal the demand of payment of the levy, and this is after they may have already appealed it. It's nuts, right? So this bill will make it much easier for the local authorities to collect their levy.
Okay, Grace. Owen.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks to Christopher and Mick for the work on the bill, and PJ and Mel for the presentation, and apologies I had to pop out to do a quick radio interview there. I suppose just a comment and then one question, Mick, but I suppose the comment is there is a huge frustration, and PJ will probably share this more than most because he'll remember some of this better than some of the allegedly younger people in the room. Every time we have a housing boom, there's a huge public debate about the rising cost of land, and there's huge public consternation, and there's debates in the Oireachtas, and lots of very sensible proposals are put forward. And then the crisis ebbs and people forget about it. So 72 we had the report on the Committee on the Price of Land. In the 1980s we had an Oireachtas Committee report on the price of land. In the 90s we had an Oireachtas Committee on the constitutional provisions on private property rights, and it related to land. And each one of those reports, made recommendations not dissimilar to some of the things we're discussing today. People spend lots of time talking about them, and then they're just ignored, and the cycle then dips and goes again. So I suppose the first point I want to make is we have to deal with this. This Oireachtas has to deal with the issue of land. And as Mick knows, Sinn Féin is very supportive of the bill, and we believe this is one of the elements of it. The other thing is we don't talk enough about land and why land speculation is driving up house prices. And Mick is right, land hoarding is part of it. But the other big part of it at the minute is that decisions in terms of changes to the tax code that were made by Michael Noonan when he was the Minister for Finance have created huge incentives for new flows of capital into the country to invest in land. Now, Mick has done huge amounts of work in what those flows of money were doing with NAMA and commercial properties. But now that a lot of the distressed assets from the commercial property crash have been bought and sold, we're now seeing that money wash its way into the residential sector. So Mick's bill relates directly to the United Nations Special Rapporteur's letter to the Irish Government and their critique of financialisation, because the reason why that money can now wash into the residential sector and invest in secure long-term land is because they pay no tax on their capital gains. They pay no tax on their rent roll if and when they build. And if they're structured in certain ways, they don't even pay dividend withholding tax to their shareholders if they're non-resident overseas investors. So we have literally billions of euros entering into the residential property market that is completely untaxed. Right? In the very best case scenario, they're hit with a 20% dividend withholding tax, but they still pay no tax on capital gains or on their rent roll. And the idea that you come in, buy, build, rent and then sell, and the Exchequer gets nothing, right? Should be a huge cause for alarm. So, of course, what else would this money do but invest in land and drive up the prices? That's why I think Mick is right that the levy has to be punitive, because that's what we're talking about in the first instance. And that's, again, why I think we're right to support the bill. So my one question, Mick, is, like all of the other bills, bar one or two that we've passed through this committee from opposition, the money message is going to be the killer. You said that in your correspondence from the Ceann Comhairle, it was the final section of the bill that was the one that they felt required the money message. It would be really great if you would share that correspondence with the committee just for our own deliberations, but I'm just wondering, is there a mechanism? Is there a mechanism for us? I mean, first of all, if that section wasn't in the bill, does the bill still have, in your view as the author of it, much of the value? And is there a mechanism for us as a committee, if we were to decide in private session to communicate to the Ceann Comhairle that in order to proceed to formal committee stage, we would lose that part of the bill that requires a money message? Now, the Ceann Comhairle might say that's not according to procedure, but I'm trying to find a way around the money message obstacle, but I don't want to propose something in private session that creates a difficulty for the bill and you as the author of the bill. So I'd like your view on that.
No, it doesn't create any difficulty. Removing that doesn't create any difficulty for the bill. Putting it in was actually going to make... the reason that we came up with this idea was that it would be more attractive to the government, who didn't want to put land, people who own land at the moment, into a possible difficulty financially. So it was actually a sweetener for them. So taking it out of the bill is not a problem at all for us, because the incentive of our bill isn't just to get people to build on land. It's to actually disincentivise land banking, which is at the source of our expensive housing in Ireland. The supply of housing in Ireland has traditionally been dysfunctional. It's not done in an even fashion, it's not done in a fair fashion, and we end up with these mad cycles of up, down, but most of the time housing in Ireland is way too expensive. So, no, my simple question is, and we will share absolutely the money message that we got, but taking it out is not a problem to us at all. But I would have thought that the government actually would like that in.
No, and my desire would not to be take it out, but if it's a choice of not taking it out and having the bill blocked to the money message or having it removed, that's something we can explore. Chair, just one other comment I wanted to make is, because you see, this isn't just about the cost of private for purchase housing. We now have postcodes in Dublin where even at the discount price for Part 5s, the local authorities can't purchase Part 5 units because they're now breaching the €400,000 cap. Like we had a crazy situation a year and a half ago where in Dalkey, Richard will remember, the land component of Part 5 units was €90,000. The state was paying €90,000 just for the land component of those apartments. We have the stuff down in the docks now, and I don't know what the price that was offered to the local authority, but it was in excess of 400,000, which is why Dublin City Council couldn't purchase. And Brendan Kenny is saying if that trend continues, there'll be whole swathes of the urban city centre that we can't even access Part 5, which then means we don't get the social mix, which is meant to be part of government policy. So I would just urge members, when we're coming to this in private session to decide how we proceed, even if people think the rate of the levy is too high, if we can get it into formal committee stage and then tease those things out, any movement in the right direction would be welcome. And certainly, look, we'll do everything we can, Mick, to support the bill and get it through. I would just be, not unlike Solidarity's anti-evictions bill, there's no point us talking about these things here if we're just then stymied by the money messages. So we can find a way around that. That would be really helpful. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Owen. Do you want to come back in on anything there? Or?
Probably a point that needs to be made, about it isn't all just about the private sector, right? And the truth is, you can't make the private sector build, and rightly so. They shouldn't be compelled. They'll build when they feel like it. But that's why there's a responsibility on the state to provide housing. We cannot be depending on an entity like the private sector in construction to supply us with housing when, in actual fact, it's unfair of us to even to try and compel them to build. They'll build when they like, and they've always done that, and that's fair enough. That's the private sector for you. But it just emphasises the fact that if we want to control the housing crisis, the supply of housing, the state has to be prepared to supply more of it. And if we want the private sector housing to be cheaper, then we've got to stop them from banking the land.
Okay. Thanks, Mick. Mick, did you have any questions? Because I have to go to members first before non-members.
No, I'll let Richard go.
Are you coming in though, Mick, are you?
No, I'll pass him.
Okay. Richard?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to Mick for that. First of all, Mick, well done, and I completely support the bill and its objectives, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that speculation and land hoarding is a very major, if not the major, contributory factor. I think to the current housing crisis and the cost, excessive cost of housing and so on. I do think Owen's point is very important as well, actually, and it's a point that isn't highlighted enough. I mean, we have done so periodically, but the tax breaks are extraordinary, and when you ask the Minister for Finance to cost them, to tell us how much is foregone on the capital gains and the rental income allowed for under those tax loopholes, they can't even tell us how much. It's shocking, but it has to be, given the increase in property prices since those tax breaks were put in place. It has to be in the tens of billions, certainly in the billions. So that they have no incentive to build, and that's really that's the sort of question I have for all of you in a way. Given I agree with every word you've said and the purpose of the bill is. Have any of the people who currently, or most of the people, if you like, who bought up this land, have they any interest in building anything at the moment? I mean, Mel is saying, which is very worrying, it's alarming when you consider the state we're in, if we're now at the top of the cycle, and maybe Mel could elaborate this point, if we're at the top of the cycle and already the output is pathetically low, because it's more profitable for them to sit and flip or whatever, and then the thing goes down, output actually reduces, we're in real deep trouble. First of all, that's the first point to make. But even then, and I support the 25%, the punitive thing. If they don't really want to build, even now, and you put that on them, they're not going to build either, are they? I mean, isn't it most likely that they will just get out of the market? Now, to me, that wouldn't be a bad thing, right? And if they have to sell it back, as that Section 12 bit you're talking about, that they would have to sell it back to the local authorities. But isn't it very likely that they will just say, well, we've made our money now, and we're going to walk and sell it back, and even then the local authorities will have to buy it back at, okay, it's 60% or 40% of current value. Will that still mean the state ends up picking up a significant bill and then walking away with a lot of profits? Maybe you could just sort of tease that.
Okay, and I'll let Mel in just to deal with.
And just one other question, Mick, just before, one other question as well, because this is something that very much sort of occurs to me, is if anybody does build now, given land prices, right, in the private sector, don't they almost have to build unaffordable stuff? Which, given land prices and land values, which is useless to the vast majority of people who are affected by the housing crisis. Because of the sort of economics that you are describing, the only viable stuff for the private sector to build is stuff that nobody can afford.
Okay, well, yeah. You have two main points there, right? First of all, if you're saying that if we put 25% levy on them, I will say, listen, I've made enough money out of this, I'll flip it. But somebody's going to hold it, someone's going to pay 25%. Secondly, they'll just take up the 60% offer that we've put in kind of in it, where the local authority, provided the purchaser and the local authority can agree that they can do a deal, right? But I can tell you that more often than not, if you have access to the finance, it will still make more sense for you to develop it out, or somebody develop it out, rather than allow the local authority to take it off you for 60. Guarantee you there'll be more money in it if you have access to the money, and some people don't obviously, but some people have, and the people with access to the money will build it out rather than see it go back to the state for 60% of what it's valued at. Right? And sorry, your second point,
and it's connected in a way to that point.
Yeah. So what? Yeah.
If they do decide to build,
my argument about that, my defence of that would be, I would argue that the vast majority of the land we're talking about that's banked, the vast majority of that was not bought at today's market values. Like, for example, Heinz are sitting on units in Cherrywood that they're valued at 120,000 plus now, but they only paid 27 for them, right? So I mean, you know, it's not like as if you're saying, oh, you can't possibly build unaffordable homes on those sites because they cost so much. They actually didn't cost a mad amount, and the majority of land that's banked wasn't bought at the high prices. In 2007, 27 entities owned it. 95% of the banked land, development land in County Dublin. 27 people or entities, right? But the only people who were actually caught in the situation you were talking about was where it's so hard to provide affordable housing, where the builders who bought it from them, and I was obviously one of them, right? Like I said, I told you about the site in Downing Street where I paid 4.8 million, and the interest on the money cost me 1.2, put me at 6 million, and it cost me 6 to build them. So half of it is land and interest, and the other only half of it is construction costs, right? But so I was caught in a situation where I had to get a minimum of 400,000 to get my money back.
That's my point.
Yeah, but the guy who owns the guy's banking the land, right? The fella I bought it from, he got it for a fraction of what I paid him, right? And the likes of Hines and Cairns and them fellas, right? Today, who have become the new land bankers, and some of the REIT buys, I mean, they bought cheap.
We'll just be careful mentioning people outside the houses.
Okay,
to remind you, yeah.
I thought that before. There was a couple of fellas I really wanted to throw under the bus, and I've refrained.
We'll just be clear, there could be men or women.
What?
There's a lot more women in construction now.
Oh,
so
sorry.
men or women. You won't throw any woman in.
Right. Anyway, maybe Mel might expand on it.
Well, just before he does, I mean that's the point though, is what I'm getting at is at 400,000, right? And in fact, when I met the Hines guy, sorry, I don't know if we're allowed to mention, they said that it was going to cost them 400,000 to build, right? The apartments. Which is just, what's the point? I asked myself, what's the point in that? Now, but some would say, and Mel could maybe elaborate this point, do they have any interest in building anything?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for anyone active in the market. All I can do is just see what's in front. In terms of your build costs, what we do know, O'Coulon is a very useful one to look at because they have sales prices. And they're building in County Dublin, and they're building apartments and houses on that site. So if they get a site for €1,000, their infrastructure cost is a little bit high, it's about 4, but they can build, make a profit, and sell a 2-bed apartment for €185,000, a 2-bed apartment. Also, for a 3-bed house, they can build, sell, including that, at 219,000. So even though the state, yes, the value of the site in Ballymun is €18,000, DCC are giving it to the end user for €1,000. But each 3-bed house is charging €26,000 in VAT as well, which goes to the Exchequer. So they're pretty well cost neutral. So if you can, depending on what way the land market goes, if site values, if this was brought in and it had an adverse effect on site values, good, because it means instead of a builder buying at 200,000 a unit and having to sell for 600, he might buy at 50 and he will sell at 450 or lower. And once there's a margin there for a builder to do it, he'll do it. He can buy and sell for 400, 600 or 250. Once there's a margin there, it's all about the land value. And I mean, currently, like land values in Dublin City are around about 10 million per hectare at the moment, based on an average density of about 90 units per hectare. It's about 110, 120 a unit, round about that. DCC values there land at about 80 per unit. So, I mean, if Dublin City Council were to build out at cost and sell and try and reclaim their full land value back, they are not in a position to sell at affordable rates. So the land subsidy is critical to any affordable rental scheme. You just cannot do it at the current market rates. So if the sort of profits that if somebody entered the market in 2012, 2013, they're paying no capital gains tax. They've seen maybe a 400 or 500% increase in their asset. Yeah. So if they get a hit at the back end, a slap on the bum on the way out of 20%, fine, I won't like it, but you're still way ahead of the posse. For the next person coming in, they may be looking at buying the sites significantly cheaper. So, it sort of swings and roundabouts, but at the end of the day, what you really need to do is to see land values reduced to a point where they make some sort of sense. And currently, the worrying thing from the private sector point of view is that valuers are telling me that the standard way of valuing, the red book value, which is where you have a sales price and you have a residual land value, is no longer relevant in a lot of locations. So that suggests that the market value is way over where it should be.
Can I just have one brief supplementary, because I'm nearly out of time. One question to PJ, actually, and then one last one to Mel and Mick.
I think that's 3 then.
Sorry, two. No, they're both the same question. To PJ. On the cost rental council housing, sort of, the need for that, and we all agree with that. What do you think on the whole issue of the income thresholds for council housing? Certainly, many of us have been arguing they have to be raised. And in fact, should there be any? Should there be any? Because it sort of drives one group into being, your social housing people, and then other people are kind of above that. So I just wanted to ask that question. But to Mel and Mick, do you think the slowness that you've all identified in the public provision of council housing and council and affordable housing, you know, PJ said they are amenable and they are doing some stuff, but it's very, very slow and less than we need. Is there a connection, because I think there is, between their slowness and their anxiety that if they built large amounts of council housing and large amounts of affordable housing that was significantly less than market prices, that would impact on the profitability of the private sector? Do you get me? And that they're worried about that. You know, in other words, if, you know, in Shangana Castle, the council built affordable housing, which was €200,000, and down the road there's a private developer who is going to be selling the same house more or less for 300,000 or 400,000, there's a big problem for the private developer if the council is putting on a large scale affordable output. Now, I think the council should do that, but is that the reason why they're not doing it on scale?
PJ want to win first.
Just before you start there, can I just say the income thresholds for affordability aren't within your bill. So, PJ?
Well, certainly, I would be in agreement with the state building very cheap houses, if you can call it that, to be in competition with the private sector. I think that's the whole point, that the state should be in competition to bring down the prices and bring down rents, because if people can purchase, as you say, a cost rental home, or they're in a local authority, if there's sufficient homes provided by the state, then the private sector will have to knuckle down and build at reasonable prices. They'll still make profits, I've no doubt. So that's the answer, really. If the state has to be very seriously involved. It's no use building, what, 4,500? They didn't even build 4,500 last year because much of it was built by the private sector. But it's just simply insufficient. The state needs to be building probably 10,000 homes per annum. Now, there could be combination of cost rental and social housing, and I think that should be integrated anyway. I would call it community housing. I think, as you say, there's a stigma associated with social housing, but everyone, they're all in the same boat, really. But the guard, the teacher, the nurse, the Dáil deputy even, perhaps, could be on the cost rental home, and the rent is perhaps 1,000 to 1,300 per month, compared to the current ask of 1,600, 2,000 per month. So, I mean, you're then in competition with the private rental sector as well. So competition, you're kind of playing the market game, if you like. The state plays the market game. Now, the state shouldn't play a market game, really, but that is what it's all about, competition. And the state has to be involved, seriously involved. And the problem, I believe, will be solved. You'll reduce prices and you'll reduce rents.
In replying to your question, Richard, we're not looking... there's a reason why Europe doesn't have our problems. Most of Europe does not have such a dysfunctional manner of supplying housing, and we should look at it more closely and see what they're at. Secondly, land prices will drop dramatically if this legislation is passed. I guarantee you it will drop by more than half immediately, and that will be the start. Nothing's fixed overnight, but it will be the start of things being done better. Nobody is building apartments in this town at the moment because the land is too dear to buy. We were talking about it earlier. You really couldn't pay more than 35 or 40,000 a unit and make money building apartments today and get your money back, right? Construction apartments is more expensive than housing anyway, right? Because for a number of different reasons, mostly around civil engineering. But what's happening in the city at the moment is student accommodation can pay 3 times the price for the land, maybe more, than someone that wants to build apartments. And that's why there's no apartments being built. Now, I'd like to know, why don't the City Council say, there's land there, no, we don't want City Council, we don't want student housing on it, we don't want a hostel or a hotel, we want apartments. And that will determine the price of it. Right? Whereas, if you're going to say, if the City Council is going to continue going with, oh, we'll sell it to the highest bidder, well, we're just going to get more student accommodation that's too expensive for the majority of people in Ireland to avail of. And yes, of course, your issue on the affordability, as PJ has highlighted, it's common sense. If the state is going to help the provision of affordable housing, then of course it's going to bring the price down for someone trying to build the same house close by.
Thanks, Mick. Mel, did you want to come in on that?
Well, I think in terms of policy since about 2012, most of the housing policies that have come in have actually inflated the value of either housing, new build housing, or land. For various different reasons. So on the one hand, they have a positive effect in terms of negative equity. They have a positive effect. NAMA's return will improve. Land values will increase to a point where building is viable. However, I don't think anybody sort of checked it and risk assessed it to see what happens when it's successful, and at what point do we say, okay, stop? Because what we have now is it's overshot, and in a way, it's when you're going up a hill, you need to accelerate, and that's fine. But at a certain point, you need somebody beside you who'll say, listen, we're at the top of the hill, we're going down the hill, and there's a corner coming. So nobody has sort of constantly checked it the way that you would when you're driving a car to say, okay, are we at it? Are we okay? Are we over it? So now we have a situation where land values, and the difficulty with that is if you overpay for land today, you have to wait for prices to reach a point. So you're effectively sterilising. If prices continue at the rate, even stabilise at current rates, you're effectively sterilising large areas of land from development because there's a huge gap between what you paid for it and what you can sell for, and you're not going to build out at a loss. So this is a painful measure. I think it's well judged. I think it's an intriguing counter-cyclical measure policy-wise for the reasons we mentioned earlier. But certainly I think the provision of affordable housing is challenging. It's a deceptively simple model. You can say, oh, look, cool on, these are the prices. However, it does leave a hole in the balance sheets of local authorities that needs to be addressed. That's challenge number one. It's probably more of a systemic threat, which I think was what your question was. Affordable housing by a private developer is probably more dangerous to a private developer, another one, than social housing because of the unconscious bias that everyone has towards social or council housing. If you could purchase a social house built by a private developer in Shangana for 250,000, why would you spend 450 buying effectively the same thing 2 doors down? So there are challenges in the model. But I think as a component, if you want to try and stop the car hitting the corner at 120 kilometres an hour, you need to put on the brakes, and this is a brake. And you know, if you don't have your seatbelt on, you're going to be in trouble. So that's the first thing, and then you need to turn the corner and start doing stuff with the local authorities.
Great stuff.
And just a quick clarification, Mick, I know you said it in general, but there's almost 1,200 apartments being built in Cherrywood currently, and I do fully agree with you. It's more expensive, more complex to deliver apartments.
I don't think Cherrywood's in this town.
Oh, you said Dublin. You said Dublin.
I said town.
Not a brick lane.
You did say Dublin. Yeah,
Town. You checked the record. I said in this town.
Yeah. No, but it's Dublin. And just to say, I'm glad to hear Shangana has been mentioned so many times, because there's a proposal on the table that went to councillors on Tuesday night that my father and I have been involved with for 2 years for, and it'll be the third cost rental PJ of up to about 340 cost rental units. So that is where we can deliver on state lands. And Mick, one final question for you. How long from you purchasing that site in Dominic Street to turnkey was it?
It probably, from the day we bought it to the time we were digging the ground, it's close to 2 years always, right? And then it takes about 2 years to build.
So it's just to emphasise the point, you cannot build a house as fast as people think that you can.
Well, housing is it's much quicker to get started on housing than apartments, right? Housing is it's very much like Lego, and it's much simpler. Apartment is much more of a civil engineering challenge than housing is. But look at housing. I think people can buy a site for housing and get it designed, get permission and start it. Just over a year, 15 months. Now maybe Mel might disagree. I don't know.
And about 9 then to build.
That'd be kind of thing. But this, the point about your Cherrywood point and the apartments, right? You must remember as well. what I'm talking, when I say there's no builders building in the town here at the moment, right? If a builder goes and looks at a site in Dublin City today, the big problem is that whoever owns it wants X amount of money for it, right? That Cherrywood stuff, as we pointed out earlier, was bought for peanuts from NAMA at an early stage. A lot of it was, right?
It still required huge investment into the
Yeah,
site
but I
and
mean, it did,
infrastructure.
yeah, but I mean, if you can buy for 27,000 a unit, I'd build you all the apartments you want.
I know, I was just correcting, there is apartments being built in Dublin, that's all I was saying to you. But look, I'm supportive generally of the bill. Can I thank all the witnesses for attending today, and we've gone well over time, so apologies for that and apologies to our next session as well. With permission of members, can we extend the next session to 1 o'clock, if that's required? Is that okay? Grand, thanks. Can I thank you very much for your attendance, and we'll be in touch with you, Mick. Is that all right? And we'll go into private session just for a minute to allow the second session to take their seats. At the request of Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe and flight mode depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones in silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 8 on the agenda is Local Government Restoration of Town Councils Bill 2018. This session today will commence detailed scrutiny of the Local Government Restoration of Town Councils Bill 2018. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome Deputy Brendan Howlin and Dr. A. Quibbleton from UCC, P.O. Smith and Miss Marie Maloney. Or Miss...
No, we're all here.
Sorry, there was 4, sorry, yeah. First of all, before we start, can I just apologise for delaying you? We went an hour over with the previous meeting, which is quite normal with housing, to be honest with you. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'd now like to call on Deputy Howlin for his opening statement.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for scheduling what I regard as a very important piece of legislation. I have circulated a script just in terms of the technicalities of it. I don't intend reading it because of the lateness of the time and the shortness of the time we have available to us. But just technically, will the remarks be included in the official record of the committee?
They will, yeah.
Yeah, just as long as that's done. In essence, Chair, I regard this as a very important piece of restoration work. And before Shane asks the question, yes, I was a member of the government that abolished town councils, and I think that was a mistake. I think one of the most important things in politics, and I'm around this House a long time, is when things, and humans make mistakes all the time, political parties make mistakes. And I said in my own remarks, my own reasoning behind why that was, there was an antipathy to politics and a blame in politics and politicians at the time for the economic crisis that we were facing. But I believe that it was a mistake to remove the really important lowest tier of local government, which was town government. I have to say this also, not in my remarks, but since I did spend some time in the Custom House as Minister for the Environment and Local Government, and there was always a certain antipathy to town government in the Custom House. They always felt that it should be a county structure, and I think probably there was an agenda item to push that for a willing minister at any given juncture. I also want to couch my proposal in the context of what's going on internationally. I think there's been a very serious erosion in people's confidence in politics and political systems, and I think we have to have regard to that. And we certainly need to have a direct connection between politics and the electorate, our citizens. And the most immediate and the most direct connecting point has been town government. I have been privileged to serve on Wexford Borough Council, on Wexford County Council. I've been mayor of my own town, and I know the direct connecting between what used to be Wexford Corporation and the people of the town. Town government also acts as if you like, a driver of economic and social activity in its hinterland. And I think the structure we replaced it with, which is these municipal districts, just have not worked. That's my honest evaluation of it. Even if you take it as an honest effort, it hasn't worked. If you look at my own area, as I say, a quarter of the county is now a municipal electoral area. It has diluted the town focus, and a lot of people have disconnected themselves from their local representative, wouldn't know them in the immediate sense that would always have been known in the past. And so for all the reasons that I've set out, we have talked across the country and produced a piece of legislation that would not replicate exactly what was there before the abolition of town councils. We've looked at what might be a better model. And the model we've posited for consideration now is that we would have a new town council. We wouldn't have the three categories that used to exist. You know, the borough councils, which were corporations, the town councils and town commissions that used to exist. But we have one category of town council. It would be available to every municipal area of 1,000 dwellings with a recognisable municipal heart that would have 5,000 people, and that would be determined by the local government commission. It would be available to towns that never had, for historic reasons, never had town councils in the past, although they have population bases much greater than some of the areas that had. And it would not restore town councils to some of the very smaller ones that I think people always pick out when they're arguing against town councils. Should there's a tiny, 70 votes will get you elected to that town council. I won't mention the ones, but there's a few that do the rounds periodically. So this is, I think, a robust suggestion. The idea would be to restore all the powers that existed in the old town councils back to town councils. I think that it makes a rock of sense. I think it would be a good democratic thing to do. It certainly wouldn't be a particularly expensive thing to do because the administration is happening in any event. So the only additionality would be the very modest cost of an additional small number of councillors. As you can see, what we're suggesting is 9 councillors for population bases below 25,000 and 15 for population bases above 25,000. As I say, I've set out it all in very great detail. I have other documentation that I'd be very happy to provide the committee, including European norms, and as you'll see, you can look, we are very much out of sync in European norms with the level of local democracy that we have, and even more, I suppose, worryingly, we're very much out of sync in the level of money we spend through local authorities. Most of the big financial decisions that impact on local communities are determined centrally. And I suppose as a former Minister for Public Expenditure, that might be something that you want to cling on to, but I actually do not. I think it is really important that we look at the models of the best performing countries, the Nordics in particular, where at least a quarter, up to a third of resources that are expended are done at local level. We are very much at the other end of that extreme, and I'd be happy to provide the documentation to the committee to do that. So I hope that I'll be in a position to answer any questions anybody has. I've asked, at the committee's request, just others to accompany me, and I feel like I have 2 practitioners who want to advocate for their own area. Marie Maloney from Killarney. Killarney is an area that I remember immediately after the abolition, the strongest lobby, because they felt that Killarney was a place that needed, if you like, a local representation that was really important. And of course, P.O. Smith from Drogheda. Again, Drogheda is a very ancient borough with an extraordinarily long tradition. And I think it was a great mistake to abolish that town council. And Dr. Quinlivan is a lecturer in governance in UCC and an expert on local government matters.
Thank you, Brendan. Dr. Quinlivan, do you want to go next?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'll go through my statement, get it done as quickly as possible. I submitted 1 or 2 other pieces of documentation as well, which can be available for all. My position is a straightforward one. I was a strong critic of the decision in 2014 to abolish town councils. So broadly, I favoured the reintroduction of a sub-county tier of local government. When I worked in Cork County Council and did my postgraduate studies by night, I was very heavily influenced by the former Limerick County manager, Dick Haslam, who was my main lecturer and also my mentor. And at that time, 25 years ago, I frequently heard people throw out the phrase, in Ireland we don't have local government, we have local administration. The focus was always on that second word, administration versus government. Now when I teach, I prefer to focus on the neglected first word. If local government is not local, then it is nothing. Local government, as we know, exists for two primary reasons: as a provider of local public services, but also as an instrument of local democracy to give expression to community self-government. This is based on the principle of subsidiarity, which states that as many powers and functions as possible should be devolved to the level closest to the citizen. Ireland has signed up to that principle under the Council of Europe's Charter of Local Self-Government, the EU's Treaty of Amsterdam, and under Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But, as the Council of Europe pointed out in 2013, we are hypocrites. We use the rhetoric of subsidiarity, power to the people, putting people first, but our public policies go in the complete opposite direction. As people know in this room, local government in Ireland is extremely weak. Staggeringly, it lacks constitutional protection. Accordingly, a whole tier of directly elected institutions, the town councils, were abolished in 2014 without reference to the people by way of a referendum, unlike for Shannon Éireann. In terms of our numbers of local authorities and local councillors, we have the most disconnected model in Europe. This year we celebrate the 120th anniversary of the first local elections, which brought the current system of local government into being. At that stage, we had over 600 local authorities. We gradually whittled it down to 114, and now we are at 31, soon to be 30 if Galway City and County Councils merge. The International Local Autonomy Index places Ireland in 38th place out of 39. Ireland is not only more centralised and developed democracies such as Austria, Finland and Germany, we are also more centralised in Macedonia and Albania. Only Moldova ranks below us. This is relevant, I think, to any discussion on town councils because we have blindly followed an appealing but fundamentally incorrect narrative, which is big is better, big is cheaper, big means improved services, and big is more efficient. The problem is that the international research evidence refutes that narrative. The evidence informs us that a smaller number of larger local authorities do not yield improvements, savings and efficiencies. To paraphrase Professor Howard Elcock, the amalgamation and abolition of local authorities is an addiction suffered by central governments. The knock-on effects are serious. The council elected in May 2019 in Cork City will have a ratio of 1 councillor per 6,800 citizens. This is a massive number in comparison to 1 to 120 in France, 1 to 210 in Austria, and 1 to 350 in Germany. And it is leading to a political fallout. Nearly 1/3 of the current members on Cork City Council are not standing in May, 3 of the young newly elected councillors in 2014 are bowing out, and half of the female elected members are leaving. Many of these councillors have cited the fact that their jurisdictions are too large and require them to be full-time councillors. Yet they are not being rewarded with a full-time salary and find it next to impossible to balance their council role with their day-to-day working lives and family commitments. We are moving in the wrong direction, but you have the opportunity to reverse that trend. Turning to a few specific arguments in favour of re-establishing a town council tier. 1. Town councils were the most efficient element within the local government system in terms of being self-financing and maintaining commercial rates at a lower level than their county council counterparts. Killarney has been mentioned, and at the time of its abolition, Killarney Town Council had the highest rate take in Kerry with the lowest rate in the euro. So there is an efficiency argument to be made. Secondly, on democratic grounds and to cite evidence as opposed to rhetoric or an appealing narrative, the wealth of evidence suggests that there is a negative relationship between the size of a local government unit and the political trust which citizens have in local elected members. In other words, the smaller the unit and the closer it is to us, the more trust we have in it. We are invested in how the town is run and how money is spent. Putting people first was a lovely slogan to attach to the policy document of October 2012, which proposed to abolish the town councils. The truth is that we have removed people from the equation. We are asking them to participate through fixyourstreet.ie in the absence of the town council. The citizen was barely mentioned in putting people first. She was kidnapped and replaced by the consumer. We opted to champion efficiency over democracy, and we have achieved neither. Thirdly, I think an important point to make is that more women were elected onto our town councils than any other level of government in Ireland. Election to your town council was in reach for very many people because if you were organised and availed of a network of family and friends, you could win a seat with a few hundred votes. Town councils were therefore a useful entry point into politics for young people generally, for women, people from different ethnic backgrounds, people with disabilities, etc. In removing that political entry point, we have narrowed the pool of people who are willing or able to contest elections for city and county councils. What is the result? Councils that are dominated by middle-aged and elderly grey-haired men who can afford to be full-time local public representatives. I have deliberately not spoken to the specifics of the Restoration of Town Councils Bill. My belief is that we need a tier of sub-county government in Ireland, and it is up to the elected representatives to tie down the specifics. There is no doubt, as Deputy Howlin has indicated, that the old town council model was severely flawed. The councils covered only 15% of the population, and the population range went from 298 to 30,000. We need a new model, but to give it meaning, powers and finance have to be devolved downwards. The municipal districts are now in place, and I think have been reasonably successful, but in a very narrow way. From talking to councillors, the effectiveness of the districts vary enormously between and within local authorities. They have played a role, partly because they are comprehensive and more or less cover the entire country, but let's be honest about it, they are glorified area committees of the county councils. So do not let anyone pretend that they are an elected tier of local government. At an overall level, we need to relax the vice-like grip of centralisation, which is suffocating local autonomy. Paulo Coelho once wrote, "A mistake repeated more than once is a decision." Since 1922, we have been making decisions in favour of centralisation. Now we need to start making decisions in favour of local democracy and local self-government. Town or municipal councils, in my view, should be at the heart of our local government system. The very nature of local government is that civic society is up close and personal. Local councils and the services they provide have a far more immediate, continuous and comprehensive impact on our daily lives than many issues which dominate nationally. Local councils and councillors have to deal with a range of issues and factors that are not of their making and for which they may in some cases have no formal responsibility. These issues include migration, multiculturalism, homelessness, social exclusion and other social problems such as drug addiction and petty crime. Many of these social problems faced by Irish communities today are most sharply evident in urban settings and towns. To conclude, in 1924, the Dáil debated the abolition of rural district councils, in the name, of course, of efficiency and cost savings. What was really meant was centralisation. During the debate, John Daly, TD from Cork, asked, "What would a man from Bantry Bay know about affairs in Arid Glen?" The world is a smaller place today. We have a continuous 24/7 news cycle and social media, but John Daly knew what he was talking about. He ended his contribution by saying, "Local representatives know their area best of all and should be given the power to tackle local problems appropriately." And it really is as simple as that. Local government must be local. Thank you.
Many thanks. Marie, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Chairperson, Deputies, thank you for allowing me to come here today to make a case for the reinstatement of the Town Councils and to support Deputy Brendan Howlin's Town Council Bill. As I've already mentioned, as Brendan has mentioned, I come from Killarney. It's a major tourism town that is steeped in history. Killarney Town Council played an important link with the local Chamber of Commerce and with local retail, industries and, most important of all, the people of Killarney Town and its hinterland. A major benefit of town councils is to encourage the role of the town as a hub for the local economy. At this stage, I must acknowledge there is now a Killarney Municipal District, which is a subcommittee of Kerry County Council. However, there is a huge demand on the members of the municipal district to give a service to their constituents, as they have a huge rural area to cover in addition to the urban areas. Killarney Municipal District has a population of around 38,000 people, and it covers a much wider area than the town itself, which has a population of just under 15,000 people. The members of the municipal district have to attend to a lot of county-wide policy, activities and meetings, whereas the town councillors could focus exclusively on the needs of the town as an urban district area. As I've already said, I come from Killarney, which is really the tourism capital of Ireland, a town which is constantly winning prizes in the tourism industry and by all guides and tourism reviewers. The brand name Killarney is huge abroad. Tourism is a major part of the economy in Killarney, and there are a number of ways in which a town council and a dedicated town mayor would benefit tourism. For example, Killarney is noted for its festivals and events in the town, where a town mayor plays an important ceremonial role. There are also meetings with delegations, including tour operators. All in all, the role of a mayor in a town the size of Killarney is certainly demanding and practically constitutes a full-time role. The chairs of the municipal districts have a range of other important duties and have many rural events and festivals to attend and represent the district and Kerry County Council. Killarney Town is twinned with 5 towns in Europe and has a sister city agreement with 4 cities in the USA. These are vital links for Killarney as they promote the town abroad and are responsible for a huge influx of tourists to Killarney and subsequently to Kerry as a whole. It is imperative that when officials from our twin towns in Europe and sister cities in the US visit Killarney, that they are greeted by a town mayor along with our twinning committee. A mayor who can dedicate his or her time to assisting and accompanying these officials during their visit. It is also imperative that Killarney reciprocate the visits by travelling to these twin towns and cities to promote Killarney and Kerry abroad. But to be able to do this, a mayor must have a dedicated allowance, as they cannot be expected to finance the visits themselves. As Killarney is heavily reliant on the tourism sector for employment, with little or no new industrial jobs or manufacturing companies coming to this area, it is imperative that we nurture and enhance our tourism industry. The more tourists that visit Killarney and Kerry as a whole, the better the knock-on effect is to the accommodation sector, the small and medium retail outlets, restaurants and bars, along with the entertainment sector, all of whom provide employment in the area. A Killarney Tourism Economic Impact Report revealed that tourism in the town generates 410 million annually. Killarney welcomes 1.1 million visitors annually, which supports over 3,000 local jobs. As I am presently a candidate in the contest of county council elections, I have been spending a lot of time knocking on the doors in the Killarney area, and time again, people have asked me about reinstating the town councils. Many of them feel a little disconnected with the members of the municipal districts, as the people feel they have too big an area to cover to give dedicated time to the town itself. They felt when the town councillors were in place, they could solely apply their time to servicing the town and ensuring that things like footpaths, roads and housing estates were up to scratch. And this was not their only function, as they assisted people with their personal needs such as housing, planning, the upkeep of local authority houses, amongst other things. It is my opinion that it was a major mistake to dissolve the town councils. And if we recognise that this mistake has been made, then we must be prepared to admit it and do something to rectify the mistake. And that is what Deputy Brendan Howland is doing by introducing this important bill. We must reinstate town councils as statutory bodies with full autonomy. Town councils were an integral part of local democracy, which has now been diminished. How can we in Ireland be such defenders of local governance and differ in this aspect with every town in Europe? And just yesterday, trade unions representing over 30,000 local council workers launched a campaign for substantially increased revenue and funding power for local authorities, and published research that showed Irish councils have less autonomy from central government than their counterparts in 39 European countries. The More Power to You campaign, which they have called it, also calls for legislative changes to facilitate directly elected mayors and restore and expand town councils. While I have spoken predominantly about Killarney Town, what I have outlined can apply to many towns around the country. Therefore, I trust that Deputy Howland will get support from all parties and none with this bill. After all, town councils have been an important part of Irish democracy for hundreds of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Theo, would you like to read your opening statement? You don't have to read it word for word, if you, or you can if you like. It's up to yourself.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read it. That's okay, Chair.
Yeah.
I'd just like to thank you, Chair, and the committee for the invitation to come here today and to present this presentation. And glad to see Fergus O'Dowd here, fellow colleague from Drogheda, who works hard for the town as well. So, one interesting aspect of the 2011 general election campaign was the extent to which questions of political reform came to the fore, like in probably no other previous general election. All the political parties advocated the view in their manifestos that political reform was central to the economic recovery of the state, and all three of Ireland's main political parties at the time did point to local government as needing significant reform. The subsequent reform that took place resulted in a reduction of local authority members from 1627 to 950, and a significant reduction in local authorities from 114 to 31. The new arrangements and structures were supposed to improve democratic responsibility and accountability, community identity, responsiveness to local issues, subsidiarity, coherence and efficiency, yield cost savings and better value for money, and generally strengthen local government. Minister Hogan argued at the time that the whole tenet of my policy is to make sure there is a rebalancing of power to the democratically elected local councillor and away from the management system. The result of the local government reform of 2014 is that the county has become the dominant political entity in regards to decision-making at local level. As a consequence of this, the stated aims of Phil Hogan and the principles contained within the Putting People First document have not been fulfilled. The outcome could have been different if the reform had not eliminated the powers of town and borough councils. I speak today in relation to my hometown of Drogheda and how the changes resulting from the 2014 local government reform have impacted on the local citizenry. Drogheda is the largest town in the country with a population of approximately 42,000 people living within the urban network. When the rural areas of Tullyallen, Monasterboice, Tem and Feckin, etc. are taken into account, the population rises to approximately 56,000. There are 10 councillors, 2 Labour, 2 Fine Gael, 1 Fianna Fáil, 2 Independent and 3 Sinn Féin on Drogheda Borough Municipal District, and they represent very well the views of Drogheda people on Louth County Council. In terms of accountability and responsibility, the old Drogheda Borough Council was a local authority in its own right, with the statutory powers that go with it, for example, planning, roads, environment, etc. In this scenario, democratic responsibility was evident and meaningful because the decisions that were taken at local level by councils could be traceable to the factors within their control. In contrast, under the current local government setup, decisions can be made by Louth County Council that can have a negative impact on a town such as Drogheda, and the councillors who vote in favour of these decisions will not be accountable to Drogheda citizens. For example, it is within the remit of Drogheda Borough Municipal District to set parking rates for the town and seek to ring-fence a portion of this revenue for spending exclusively within the Drogheda Borough District. At the 2018 Drogheda Borough Municipal District annual meeting, I proposed raising the parking charges and ring-fencing the money to be spent in Drogheda. At this meeting, the Chief Executive of Louth County Council said that if Drogheda councillors agreed to this proposal, she would bring a new parking bylaw proposal to the county meeting to overturn the one that would be set by the municipal district. What actually happened was that councillors at one of the municipal district meetings reduced the parking rate to €1, and then at the annual budget meeting in County Council, a pay parking bylaw was brought in to bring it back up to €120, thus overturning the decision at the municipal district level. In my view, this is evidence of how a decision taken at municipal district level can be overturned at county level against the wishes of Drogheda councillors, if a majority of county councillors vote to do so. In other words, the citizens of the town might wish that their councillors increase taxation so that money can be spent improving, for example, heritage structures. And this may not happen because councillors in Ardee and Dundalk objected to the proposal and outvote the Drogheda councillors on the county council meeting. This example also highlights how responsiveness to local issues can be lost at a county level. In regards to the role of the Mayor, it could also be argued that the community identity has been diluted in the role of the Mayor of Drogheda is now a secondary function to that of the Chair of Louth County Council. The 2014 local government reform stated that the Chair of the County Council was the first citizen of the county. This has caused much angst among Drogheda people and their politicians. Furthermore, while many people can have a negative view of politicians, the role of Mayor was owned by the people of the town. And because of the reforms, a perception was created that the political status of the town was further downgraded. Remote management. Since the reform of local government, the numbers of local authority staff allocated to Drogheda and their role has changed considerably. The post of town clerk has gone, and we have a town engineer who cannot make decisions without referring to a higher authority at county level. This can result in a bad decision-making process. For example, in 2018 there was a significant demand in Drogheda from social housing tenants for maintenance to be carried out on their homes. A large portion of the housing stock in Drogheda is over 30 years of age. Housing staff from the Borough Council days would have built up an extensive knowledge base regarding the council tenants and therefore could make accurate decisions in regards to the prioritising of maintenance requests. However, in 2018 the decision making on maintenance issues for Drogheda was made in Dundalk. The lack of local knowledge resulted in some minor maintenance requests being sanctioned, while more serious ones were left waiting. This caused considerable annoyance to tenants, some of whom had to wait until after Christmas for works to be carried out, and further strengthened the perception in Drogheda citizens' minds of we are being governed by Dundalk. In essence, the town is being managed remotely. There is no meaningful council presence in Drogheda. Furthermore, there is no specific Drogheda town development plan. The old plan was devised by the then Drogheda Borough Council for 2011-2017. This plan covered conservation, heritage, infrastructure, tourism, environment, recreation and amenities, housing and communities and much more, all of which is specific and meaningful to the people of the town. There was no review as to whether the aims and objectives of this plan were achieved. This in itself is a staggering indictment of the failure of the 2014 reforms and the need to reintroduce town councils. This is further evidence that the reforms led to a dilution of community identity and distrust of the political system. In terms of subsidiarity, a stated aim of the 2014 reforms was to develop and expand the concept of subsidiarity. The general aim of the principle of subsidiarity is to guarantee a degree of independence for a local authority in relation to a higher body or for a local authority in relation to central government. It therefore involves the sharing of powers between several levels of authority, a principle which forms the institutional basis of federal states. However, I suggest that the local government reforms of 2014 went against the principle of subsidiarity in regards to Drogheda. Power and resources, for example decisions on roads, planning, etc., were taken from the local and devolved to the central. Local democratic structures and local consumers and communities were politically disenfranchised. The political representatives at local level, that is Drogheda, had their powers to make decisions diluted and indeed in some cases eliminated. Furthermore, civic groups such as the Drogheda City Status Group and business groups such as the Drogheda Chamber of Commerce advocate for a return to the Town Council to Drogheda. The reforms failed to bring local government and decision makers closer to the citizens and failed to enable citizens to participate more effectively in shaping the public policy decisions and servicing outcomes that impact upon their lives. In regards to rebalancing of power, in my opinion, the power of the Chief Executive greatly exceeds the powers of elected representatives. For example, Louth County Council is now the leading shareholder in Drogheda Port Company. However, councillors in Louth County Council across parties had a preference for Louth County Council to take control of Drogheda Port Company as an administrative unit rather than as a shareholder. Councillors voted unanimously in favour of the administrative option. However, the Chief Executive decided on the shareholder option and negotiated accordingly, which was within our right. The recommendation of 29 councillors had no impact on the final decision. There is no meaningful rebalancing of power in regard to Chief Executive-Councillor relationships. To conclude, while the Local Government Reform Act of 2014 was well-intentioned, it failed in its primary purpose of bringing meaningful local government closer to the citizen. In contrast, focusing on political and local government reforms that can plan and account for urban-led growth of towns and their environs holds out greater promise for a positive, closer citizen-local government relationship. Thanks, Chair.
Deputy Castles is substituting for Deputy Casey.
Thanks, Chairperson. Always good to be in this committee. Always good to be discussing local government. And I think the points actually made before by Deputy Howland in respect of maybe local government because of the seriousness of housing being, relegated in terms of discussion is one well made. So I welcome the debate here this morning. I welcome all of the witnesses. I'd be well used to listening to Councillor P.O. Smith on my own local radio station LMFM along with Deputy O'Dowd. And indeed a lot of the issues that he spoke about as well in the context of the councillors being outvoted in terms of the parking charges or the Drogheda Port thing, I'd be very well aware. So I'd like to welcome everybody. And just like Deputy Howland, I was proud to have been mayor of my town. I'm coming up now in this summer 20 years since I was first elected in the 1999 elections to Navan Town Council. So I believe passionately about this process, about your proposals, about the proposals that I have formally brought as well, because it is our party position as formally moved by our Town Council bill in 2017, and the progress of that bill was frustratingly slow after second stage, and it was eventually killed by the Cabinet last week. So it will be interesting to see the reaction equally to your proposals, because I do believe in the rebalancing of democracy as outlined by Dr Quinlivan. I find it particularly troublesome, Chairperson, in the way in which the government, in killing the bill, and in particular Minister Feeling, his attempts to frame this debate, because his stating that he believes that by giving a citizen 2 votes, one for a town council and one for a county, it's some way undemocratic. Now, I think nothing is more undemocratic than what happened in the killing of the councils in the first place, but I don't believe that's undemocratic. And the attempt to frame my proposals, or indeed that of Deputy Howland's, as undemocratic, I think is wrong. It's flawed. It misses the point that urban spaces, large towns, are unique spaces. They require special management, they require special budgets, they require special development plans, as Councillor Smith has outlined. The over-centralisation, as Dr Quinlivan has said, is just inexcusable when you see the table that you have produced, and we coming effectively bottom of that table across Europe. And also that what Deputy Howland has said, that we have diluted the focus on our towns by virtue of what has happened, and they have been left poorer places as a result of this shift from their statutory basis to the flawed municipal district model. Marie, you mentioned the launch yesterday of the 3 unions forced to SIP and Connect. I was there myself, and it's a welcome debate instigated. Their campaign is called More Power to You. It has a 5-point plan. Number 1 about that is democracy and the call for the reinstation of the town councils system. We also discussed, Councillor Dermot Lacey was there, the issue of the funding powers. Now, your contribution here was very focused on Killarney and the rates based there. I have a very good friend on Killarney Municipal District, Councillor Niall Kelleher, who is also Vice President of the Chamber of Commerce down there. And it's interesting that Dr Quinlivan mentioned the rates taken Killarney and the efficiency, because Councillor Kelleher was telling me that set out now in the town, so you would have around €10.9 million of rates in the Killarney Municipal District, but 7.3 million of that is coming from the very small centre of the town. And what he has said to me since the abolition of Killarney Town Council is that there has to be a redistribution of the money raised in the town, and that is infuriating the business community, because they are raising the lion's share of the rate base, and it's not being reinvested now, as had been the case in the town core. And that's a fundamental issue, I think, that both myself and Deputy Howland would agree in terms of that. So could I ask your view, Deputy Howland, on that very issue, the retention of the rates base, and also in terms of, because you touched on it, the examination of the boundary, because that has been a key bugbear for decades and decades, because directors of finance and county managers, I know we went through a boundary extension in Navan back when Minister Gormley was there, and when the proposals came out from the Customs House, what was interesting was there was a loop put around Tara Mines to make sure Tara Mines, which would have a huge rates base, was kept outside the potential. So can I ask your opinion in terms of, because you said this would be a different model, that the town boundaries, in terms of from an administrative point of view, from a finance point of view, would be reflective of the true town, and that you wouldn't have a situation where you'd be divvying up boundaries to ensure that the kind of lucrative rates would be retained by the county and not the town. If I could just start with that question first, please. Will I ask all my questions now, Chairperson?
Ask them all now, and I'll
okay, that's fine. Okay, well that'll be the first one then.
Yeah.
In terms of the statutory planning powers, I presume that you would be looking to seek to retain or to reinstate the development plan process on a statutory basis within the town council system as well. Can I also ask you in terms of the directly elected mayors, because Councillor Smith mentioned the role of the mayor in respect of the Drogheda Port Company, and I suppose we have the potentially anyway, if the government has any information, the pilot plebiscite for Cork and Limerick and Waterford for the city basis. Have you thought about in terms of the actual impact of the potential, because Councillor Smith touched on the role of the mayor, at a kind of large town council basis for the likes of Drogheda or Navan or Wexford, and the role within that as well, because I think that is an important point in the rebalancing of powers. And can I also ask maybe Dr Quinlivan from that question as well on that role of a directly elected mayor in a town council system, because I know from engagements I would have with town twinning processes across Europe and Italy, where we would have numerous, and the role of the mayor and the power of the mayor is quite distinctive in terms of the composition of effectively like a mini cabinet as well in his local town authority. So if I could just ask those questions. And can I also just ask Deputy Howland, in terms of the threshold for the 5,000, I know my particular proposal set a slightly higher threshold. It's an issue of debate within all political parties, because ultimately deputies and so forth will be looking for their towns at the threshold to be set so that they come in. My own personal belief is we should be going, first of all, for the larger towns to give them the sense of autonomy in terms of budgetary and planning powers, that they can achieve substantial things. The likes of Drogheda, Navan, Wexford, Killarney. But can I ask then, do you believe that if Drogheda gets it, Ardee should get it? If Navan gets it, Kells should get it? If Wexford gets it, New Ross should get it? You know, I mean, and I suppose it's an arbitrary figure, 5,000, but in terms of the beliefs that you held to come to that figure in the first instance, and the explanation behind that. So that's all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Fergus, do you want to come in there? Yeah. I'm going to take it together because I'm conscious of vote, because there is 3 votes.
I apologise for being late. I didn't hear Deputy Howland's comments, but I did listen with great interest to the other commentaries, and I suppose that somewhat like Deputy Howland, I've been involved in local government for a long, long time, and in fact for about 26 years I served in the local council as mayor, so I'm familiar, and I fully support the points made by Councillor Pio there. He's absolutely right, and he's absolutely right. It's an appalling vista that has been visited on the town of Drogheda because it isn't in control of its own destiny. It doesn't have local accountability. It doesn't have a town manager, and it has absolutely no relevance, as you say, many times when the debate moves from the municipal to the county level. So I fully support the changes that are implicit, and obviously I didn't hear Deputy Howland, but I am very much behind those. I would like to say this, that I have argued for, and I fully support, the city status of a town like Drogheda in control of its destiny, and I believe that it is time now for the county manager and the minister and the Department of Housing and Local Government to appoint a manager into the town of Drogheda with the status at least of deputy city manager to plan and to negotiate with Louth County Council and with Meath County Council the proper and fair and appropriate development of the town and of its adjoining portions of County Meath without, and I stress this, and I know our Deputy Castells will notice that without infringing on the Meath jersey there. As you can imagine, for that to happen, you need somebody with a lot of skill. But I think that's what we need to manage the growth of Drogheda, which is a city. It will be effectively, it will reach the population. The benchmark is 50,000 citizens in the in the area, where the Central Statistics Office define an urban conurbation, Drogheda will reach that by 2023-24. That's what the CSO tell me, and I think to prepare for that change, we needed to be led professionally by a full-time executive who has the power to make all those decisions, together with a local council to do that. Now, that's what I'm pushing for. I've met with the Taoiseach, I've met with the Chamber of Commerce, and I think we're all ad idem on this. It must happen. I think one of the issues you have in County Louth, without putting the final tooth in it, is that there's a dysfunction between the members of the local authority and the administration, and it is unacceptable. It is, to me, unacceptable, and I'm not personalising this, that meetings of the municipal council or functions in the town of Drogheda are not represented at the very highest level by the chief executive of the council. And I think there is a mandatory obligation on those to attend and to be present at those meetings. And if I'm right, that hasn't happened for some years now in terms of your municipal council meetings. When I was on the council, I'm sure when Deputy Howland was on his in Wexford, that the manager had a mandatory attendance at least twice a month with his full management team in the town, in public, to be accountable, to answer. And it's not just fix the streets, but it's to plan the future development. And that is what is missing, and I fully support you in that. So I think, as far as I'm concerned, the door is wide open for change. The other point I note is the question of urban regeneration in Drogheda has not been met by funding from the department as yet. Now I know it's on an appeal at this moment in time, and obviously due process has to take place there. But I think that to be denied the urban development that it needs and the money to plan and restore our town centre is also unacceptable. And I suppose, as regards Drogheda Port, I'm not on the county council. I don't know what happened, but I presume if they're accountable to the county council, there is an annual report they have to produce, and they can be required to attend at your council meeting to discuss that report and any other issues that arise from it. And I think if there are issues of concern, that is, to my view, that is the way maybe to manage it. But I think ultimately, and this is the big question, and I think Dr. Quilvin, addressed it there, that there is a lack of interest in local government now. You're right. I don't truthfully know how many people in Drogheda could name even 5 or 6 of our local councillors. I'm not sure that I can name them all. I know the ones I talk to regularly. And that's the truth. Whereas years ago, there was fire and brimstone at every council meeting. You couldn't walk downtown without having an argument with somebody else. So the vibrancy, the liveliness, the dynamic is gone from local government. There is no doubt about that. Absolutely no doubt about that. And I think that its restoration, it may not happen right now. And I have a feeling that this local government election coming will be a low poll. I think it will be a low. I don't want it to be a low poll. But I think the debate, but the other point is, I suppose you have to acknowledge, is that accountability has moved onto Facebook and other media from, say, the local press or whatever. And I think that that the presence of social media, of local government itself needs to be improved. And I'd like to fix my street, provided it's fixed. I don't know if it isn't. But I have to say, that there's lots of changes taking place, and I think your positions are in the vanguard of that change. The last point I have to make, I say it as someone with grey hair, one of those people. The one good thing, I can't change my age, but I can change my grey hair. But I choose to leave my hair as it is, and I'm very proud of it. And I think that your cattle, and I say this, look, come here. There's a lot more people would have grey hair if they didn't use the bottles. That way. I'll talk about men, by the way. I'll talk about men. So, and I would say that with age comes wisdom and knowledge and experience, and thankfully a good sense of humour. So thank you. But I really appreciate your points.
Unquestionably the biggest supporter of Drogheda at every meeting. In fairness, Fergus always does fight for his county. Some of those questions weren't relevant to your bill, Brendan, but they did give the context of it. But do you want to answer things in particular? Yeah.
If I may firstly thank both deputies for their supportive comments. I think that anybody who has had experience of local government at that level appreciates its value, and I think we should strive to restore it. If, as Deputy Castle says, there is pushback in this stall for whatever months, I think if we actually advance this bill, whoever forms a future government, I think, will put this back on the agenda. I think it's really important for those reasons. A number of specific questions. The bill in its structure is very simple. It actually simply repeals the abolition and restores the powers that used to exist in the Old Town Council. So it would be a rating authority. It would be a planning authority. All those things, you don't have to actually specify it out. You simply do away with the abolition. And that's what the bill sets out. In terms of who sets the boundaries, and I'm very conscious of how fraught such an issue can be, not only in Drogheda between Louth and Meath, but I was reading significant court cases between members of the same party in relation to Waterford and Kilkenny, for example. And maybe it's the hurling tradition, but I know the most fierce protectors of Ross Birkin, which is genuinely part of New Ross, but it's on the other side of the River Barrow. The closer you get to a county boundary, the more definitive the protection would be. I was going to tell a joke, but I better not, in terms of the boundary of Wexford and Kilkenny. They are real issues. So what I'm suggesting we do is that we would give that role to the Local Government Commission. We've all seen situations where very odd decisions were made for reasons that basically were pushed upon it by an executive. For example, you talked about Tara Mines going around it. I remember when Wexford Borough was extended, the main industrial base on the south side of it was excluded in no rational way, because they said it would impoverish the county council to lose the industrial estate. And I think you need to take that out of it and make rational developmental decisions for the natural hinterland of a town to grow. In terms of whether 5,000 should be the threshold, I mean, that's entirely a matter of debate, and I'd be open to any suggestion, although you instance a town like New Ross. New Ross is actually one of the oldest existing urban towns in Ireland. Established by the Normans when they arrived and first settled in this country 800 years ago. And the Ross tapestries depict the establishment of the municipal boundary.
That's the very point.
That's the point. So,
say towns who had a very historical town council, Kells would be the same.
Absolutely.
But I know that in Meath's case, Ashbourne, which is one of the fastest growing towns, would now be the second biggest town in Meath and have no town council previously. So in terms of your rationale, that's what I was just asking.
Well, that's why we just said 5,000, because it would capture, I think, most of the historic ones. But I mean, again, I was going to avoid mentioning ones, but places like Lismore, which traditionally had a town council, I don't think could justify it. I think you need to have a critical mass. But whether 5,000 is high enough a threshold is a matter of debate that I have no fixed in stone position on, but that's what I'm advocating in the bill.
I was just asking, though, in terms of your rationale for coming to that figure, was it a case of trying to capture as many as had previously been?
We looked, and I think we circulated as an attachment all the populations of all the towns that would be captured by a population base of 5,000, and it seems to me that I think I circulated this, have I? The 2 pages of towns starting with Arklow and ending in Youghal that would meet the threshold, and there's no town in it, I think, that you'd exclude. That's why the reasoning behind it. The other questions, directly elected mayor, this is not encompassed in my proposals. And I have no fixed view on that either. And I'd be interested in hearing people's views on it. If you have in a town like Wexford or a town like Drogheda or a town like Navan a directly elected mayor, how does that impact on the other councillors in the area? If you have a 5-year term where you've a powerful one individual, I think it diminishes the others. But whether that's a good thing necessarily or a bad thing, I haven't a fixed view on. And that's why it's not part of these, although I just have this week tabled a parliamentary question to the Minister to ask him, does he intend, because I've had a lot of correspondence to see these plebiscites that are going on in the major cities, are they going to be rolled out to the larger towns? I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Deputy O'Dowd, obviously, always great advocate for Drogheda and right, and there's nothing he said that I would disagree with. I think there is a big issue that we need to get our heads around, and that is the power between the executive and the elected members. And it is very difficult when you have such a disparity of capacity in terms of people who are part-time, they're not full-time, they're not resourced. I looked at this many years ago and I produced a document called Better Local Government. And my suggestion at that stage, which I think is the genesis of a good idea, and I think it just never has been implemented in the way I envisaged it, and that is the Strategic Policy Committee being chaired by an elected councillor. So that, for example, my idea at the time was, in housing, you would have an SPC chaired by a councillor who would be the effective Minister for Housing for the locality. And it wouldn't be the housing officer making the presentation at the monthly meeting, it would be the chair of the SPC. And the housing officer would be reporting to the chair of the SPC. And then the corporate policy group would be, in effect, the cabinet. Now, that was the idea I had, but that didn't work out. It hasn't been driven. And part of it is resources, because you can't expect part-time people to be on top of it in the way that full-time administrators are. I think there's a job of work yet to be done, and I think Fergus is absolutely right in relation to that matter. The final point I would make, and it is something that it was in my original contribution, but I didn't mention it when in my spoken contribution, and that is, I do think that there is a real argument in terms of participation in democracy at town council level. There are people who have been traditionally members of town councils who would never stand even for the county council because they're just part of their own town and their community. And for that very reason that A has suggested, you'd far more women involved, you'd far more ethnic difference involved, far more people with disabilities involved. And I think that is a very good thing if you get those involved. And one of the reasons for that is that when I was a member of Wexford Borough Council, and I'm sure it's true of all of them, all our meetings virtually were in the evenings. So people could do a job. And you could actually attend your meetings. They were always at 7:30. People can't hold down a full-time job and go to monthly or fortnightly meetings during the day.
Do you want to come back in, Mr. Griffin?
Yes, just one or 2 points I scribbled down. In terms of the directly elected mayor issue, I don't think there would be a necessity for a directly elected mayor in towns. It comes back, I suppose, to the overall idea behind local government that I mentioned in terms of delivering services and the more democratic benefit. You know, the model that's always trotted out is France with 36,000 communes. So when I was an undergraduate 25 years ago, they were talking about France having 36,000 communes, and France still has 36,000 communes. And in most countries, the pressure has been to merge and abolish local authorities. And in France, if you try to abolish your local town council, there would be war. They're very happy to work together to deliver services, but they need their own council and their mayor. I was in a place 2 summers ago with 27 inhabitants. They had a mayor, they had a town hall, a guy with a sash, and they were very proud. But symbolically, it was hugely...
You have to be grey and old.
Okay, that's all right. Yeah.
So symbolically, it was hugely important to them. It was based on that idea of democracy that you devolve to the bottom. So a bottom-up approach. As many powers and functions at the lowest level. What you can't do, you pass up to a higher tier, and what they can't do, you go to the state. In other words, national government should do a few things well, not a lot of things badly. It's got too much kind of going on. A few other quick points of view, if I'm okay, Chair. We look at things maybe in a piecemeal fashion. I think we need to look at local government reform as a total piece in terms of devolving powers and functions. You know, we are looking at town councils here. There are plebiscites taking place under directly elected mayors. We've seen no proposals for local government reform generally, as has been acknowledged. Maybe housing has dominated that department's agenda. In terms of the town councils, I think a very simple point: the towns that had town councils were better, in my opinion, in terms of libraries, the swimming pools and the sense of kind of civic community. I was interested in Pio talking about the support of the Chambers of Commerce, because that certainly wasn't the case, unfortunately, in 2014. I think they bought into generally the idea of efficiency and let's abolish. So it's good that maybe they're turning around and appreciating things.
The Chamber of Commerce nationally are still maintaining the status quo of the MDs. There were President of the Chamber of Commerce of Ireland was in Navan only a couple of months ago with Minister Humphreys and saying that it was a great thing. So
yes. So that's an ongoing battle, even though for a lot of businesses in towns they saw their rates go up after the abolition of the town councils. Totally accept the point about age and wisdom, but also, of course, the avenue for...
We say us as we age.
Exactly.
All of us. Who hasn't got grey hair?
But of course, also the point is about town councils being an avenue for people, younger people in different generations to come through. And ideally, maybe your town council should be as apolitical as possible. In terms of the balance of powers, between chief executives and councillors, we could have a long argument. I think we probably do need a rebalancing. It's probably also fair to say some elected members abdicate their powers, and while a lot of them would say we should have more powers vis-à-vis the chief executive, some of them would run a mile if they got those powers, but that's a slightly separate issue. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
I think the last one is the key point, and that's where the directly elected mayor, and I appreciate it would have to be over a certain size town, but not just the major cities, would take that responsibility, would insist on that change. And I think that's at the heart of what's happening in Drogheda, really, is that we don't have somebody that is accountable to answer, because they don't live in the town, they don't come to the town in terms of their statutory meetings, and yet they make all the decisions. Whereas there's a directly elected mayor, he or she is on the spot, and they'll be fired if they don't do their job.
Thanks, Fergus. I think on that point we're going to leave that. We open that one up. Can I thank all our witnesses for attending today, and apologies again for delaying you, because we went an hour over initially, which delayed you an hour here this afternoon. So can I thank Marie, Brendan, Pio and A for coming in this morning, and I'm sure we'll have ongoing conversation about this. We'll decide next week where we proceed with this bill. So for now, this meeting stands adjourned. Many thanks.
Thank you. Well done.